There is a forest in eastern Poland that does not look like a crime scene. The trees are tall and quiet. The soil is dark and undisturbed, or at least, that is what it was meant to look like. Birds move through the canopy. A narrow road cuts through the pines. And if you did not know what you were looking for, if no one had ever told you what happened here, you might walk through this place and feel nothing more than the particular stillness that old forests carry. But historians know something about silence. Silence, in places like this, is not peace, it is architecture. It was built deliberately by people with specific tools, with a specific purpose. The silence here was manufactured, and the story of how it was manufactured and how it was broken is the reason we are here tonight. My name does not matter. What matters is that I have spent a long time sitting with this history, not the version in thin textbooks, not the summary on a placard at a memorial, but the granular, uncomfortable, deeply human story of a place called Sobibor, a place that the people who built it fully intended for the world to forget. They failed. What you are about to hear is not a comfortable story, but I want you to understand something before we begin. This is not a story about monsters winning. This is, at its core, a story about what ordinary human beings are capable of, on both ends of that spectrum. The people who designed Sobibor were not mythological villains. They were bureaucrats, engineers, veterans of an earlier killing program, men who filed paperwork and ate breakfast and wrote letters home. And the people who resisted inside Sobibor were not mythological heroes either. They were tailors, carpenters, soldiers, farmers, people who had been stripped of everything and who still found a way to act. That tension between the machinery of dehumanization and the irreducible persistence of human agency is what makes Sobibor one of the most studied, most debated, and most morally important stories of the entire Second World War. This documentary is long. It is meant to be. You cannot compress 250,000 lives into 45 minutes and call it justice. So settle in. The forest has been quiet for long enough. If you are new here, welcome. If you have been with us before, you already know what we do. We go slow, we go deep, we go honest. Hit the subscribe button if this is the kind of history you want more of. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The World Before the Wire. Eastern Poland and the Jewish communities of the Lublin district. Before there was a camp, there was a region, and before you can understand what was destroyed at Sobibor, you have to understand what existed there before the first post was hammered into the ground. The area we are concerned with sits in the southeastern corner of what is today Poland, a stretch of low, flat country running between the cities of Lublin and Chelm, bisected by a modest railway line, edged on all sides by pine forest and agricultural land. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland from the west and the Soviet Union moved in from the east, this region had been home to Jewish communities for centuries, not for decades, not for a generation, but for 400 and 500 years of continuous layered settlement. The Jews of the Lublin district were not a monolithic community. That is an important distinction, and one that later Nazi documentation tended to erase by design. They were Hasidic and secular, wealthy merchants and subsistence farmers, yeshiva scholars, and factory workers. Lublin itself had been a center of Jewish learning since at least the 16th century, home to the famous yeshiva of the sages of Lublin, an institution whose reputation extended across Central and Eastern Europe. Smaller towns, Kelm, Lodawa, Izbica, had their own distinct Jewish cultures, their own synagogues, their own communal institutions, their own internal arguments about modernity and tradition, and what it meant to be both Jewish and Polish in the 20th century. The interwar period, that fragile 20-year window between 1918 and 1939, had not been easy for these communities. Poland's Jewish population, estimated at somewhere above 3 million in the late 1930s, faced structural anti-Semitism in employment, education, and political life. There were economic boycotts, numerous clausus restrictions at universities, and periodic violence. But, and this matters, communities endured, they organized. They built schools, theaters, political parties, youth movements, newspapers in Yiddish and Hebrew and Polish. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, alive. Then September of 1939 arrived. The German invasion of Poland was not simply a military operation. It brought with it the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, and a set of administrative policies designed to isolate, concentrate, and ultimately eliminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. From the first weeks of the occupation, Jews were subjected to forced labor, confiscation of property, mandatory identification markings, and systematic humiliation. The purpose was not random, it was sequential. Each step removed a degree of autonomy, a degree of economic security, a degree of connection to the non-Jewish world around them. By 1941, the German civil administration had established a structure called the General Government. The General Government, a vast occupied territory encompassing central and southern Poland, that was neither incorporated into the Reich nor treated as a separate sovereign entity. It was, in effect, a colonial extraction zone, and within it the Jews were to be concentrated into ghettos. The Lublin ghetto, the Warsaw ghetto, the Krakow ghetto. These were not simply holding areas. They were mechanisms of slow destruction, deliberately overcrowded, deliberately undersupplied, deliberately isolated from food networks and medical care. Historians argue about the precise timeline of when the decision to move from concentrated ghettoization to mass murder was made at the highest levels of the Nazi state. The honest answer is that the evidence is complex and the debate is ongoing. What is not in dispute is the outcome. By late 1941, a different and more direct method of killing was being implemented at a site called Chelmno, the first of what would become the dedicated killing centers of the Nazi final solution. Chelmno used gas vans, mobile units in which victims were locked and killed by carbon monoxide piped in from the vehicle's engine. It was brutal. It was efficient by the horrifying standards of what the planners wanted, and it pointed toward a more structured approach. The men at the center of what came next were based not in Berlin, but in Lublin, in an SS and police command structure that would eventually produce the most concentrated killing operation in human history. A program with a code name that referenced a dead man, and an ambition that covered an entire occupied country. In the town of Sobibor itself, a small settlement along the Chelmno-Ladawa railway line, there was almost nothing before the spring of 1942. A station, a forester's house, pine trees to the east, agricultural flatland to the west. The railway was single track. The nearest significant town was Chelm, roughly 50 kilometers to the southwest. The planners who surveyed the site in early 1942 noted its qualities in logistical, not aesthetic, terms. Remote enough to prevent outside observation, close enough to existing rail infrastructure to receive transports from across occupied Poland, and surrounded by enough natural screening, those pines, that what was built here could remain invisible to the world for as long as the planners intended. The community that had existed here for generations, the people of Lublin, of Chelm, of Ladawa, of dozens of smaller towns whose names appear in transport manifests but not in most history books, did not know what was being planned. That is not a failure of intelligence on their part. It is a reflection of the degree to which the planning was deliberately obscured, deliberately coded, deliberately separated from the world in which they still lived their lives. They went to synagogue, they argued. They worried about food and their children's futures. They had no access to the bureaucratic documents being circulated in Lublin and Berlin that would determine whether those futures existed at all. There is a historiographical question that surfaces regularly in the literature on this period. The question of how much ordinary Poles, non-Jewish Poles, knew about what was being built in places like Sobibor. The evidence is genuinely mixed. Some local residents assisted the construction. Some were used as laborers and then removed from the area. Some observed trains arriving and never departing, heard sounds that did not belong to a farm or a factory, and drew their own conclusions. The post-war testimony on this question is complicated by fear, by shame, and by the complex moral landscape of a country that was itself under violent occupation. This is not a question with a clean answer, and any script that pretends otherwise is not being honest with you. What we can say with the confidence of documented evidence is this. The world that existed in the Lublin district before 1942 was real, was complex, was layered with centuries of human experience, and was systematically targeted for destruction by a state apparatus that had moved, in fewer than 3 years, from legal discrimination to physical annihilation. The forest near Sobibor was just a forest. What it was about to become was something that had never existed before in human history. Not at this scale, not at this speed, not with this degree of industrial deliberation. Understanding what existed before the wire is not just contextual background. It is the essential moral foundation of everything that follows. Chapter 2. Operation Reinhard, the Architecture of Annihilation. The name itself requires explanation. Operation Reinhard, sometimes written Einsatz Reinhard in German administrative documents, was named, at least in the understanding of most historians, after Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Main Security Office, who was assassinated in Prague in May of 1942. Heydrich had been one of the principal architects of the machinery that was now being built in the forests of occupied Poland, and his death, while celebrated by the Czech resistance, did nothing to slow the program that bore his name. If anything, the men who ran it in Lublin, and particularly the SS and police leader Odilo Globoknik, appear to have accelerated their work in the months that followed. The Globoknik is a figure who does not receive the same level of historical attention as Himmler or Heydrich or Eichmann, and that imbalance deserves correction. He was an Austrian, a long-time Nazi party member, a man whose career had been marked by both zealotry and scandal. He had actually been removed from an earlier position over financial irregularities, but Himmler reinstated him and placed him in command of the SS apparatus in the Lublin district, and in that role Globoknik became the operational manager of one of the most catastrophic killing programs in recorded history. He was not a philosopher of ideology. He was a logistics man. He thought about trains, about personnel, about the sequencing of operations. He was, in the most chilling sense, a project manager. The formal structure of Operation Reinhard called for the construction of 3 dedicated killing centers in the General Gouvernement: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Each was to serve a different geographical area of the occupied territory, drawing in Jewish populations from the surrounding district. Belzec was the first to become operational in the late winter of 1942, and its construction was used as a template for what followed. The man who oversaw the physical construction of these facilities, surveying sites, sourcing materials, directing labor, was an SS construction specialist named Richard Tomala, who moved between the 3 sites as each was built. The engineering knowledge gained at each site was applied to the next, which is why Sobibor, the second to be constructed, reflected improvements over Belzec's initial design. The concept underlying all 3 centers was, in its horrifying simplicity, the elimination of everything that made a death toll visible. There were no large-scale prisoner populations. There were no long-term detention facilities in the conventional sense. The entire architecture, the railway spur, the reception area, the processing zones, the final path, was designed to move people from the moment of arrival to the moment of death in the shortest possible time, using the smallest possible permanent staff, and leaving the smallest possible documentary trail. The killing centers of Operation Reinhardt were not, in this sense, comparable to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was both a labor camp and a killing center, and maintained a vast bureaucratic record of its prisoner population. At Sobibor, no prisoner registration numbers were issued to those who arrived to be killed. They arrived, they died. The intent was that the world would never count them. The decision to use carbon monoxide, specifically the exhaust from a diesel or gasoline engine, rather than the Zyklon B pellets that would later be associated with Auschwitz, was a practical rather than ideological choice. The T4 program, the earlier Nazi operation targeting German citizens with disabilities, had already developed and standardized carbon monoxide delivery in enclosed chambers. The personnel who staffed the Operation Reinhardt camps were, to a striking degree, veterans of T4. They had the institutional knowledge, the psychological preparation, and the technical familiarity to operate this specific killing method. This is a detail that matters both historically and morally. The Holocaust did not emerge fully formed from nowhere. It built on earlier programs, earlier cruelties, earlier bureaucratic normalizations of mass killing. The staff structure that Globotnik assembled for the Operation Reinhardt camps was deliberately lean. Each camp was commanded by a relatively small number of SS officers. At Sobibor, this was typically between 20 and 30 SS men at any given time, supplemented by a guard force of several hundred men drawn primarily from Soviet territories, mainly Ukrainians who had been captured as prisoners of war and then recruited or coerced into service as auxiliary guards. These men are referred to in the historical literature as Traunickis, after the SS training facility at Trauniki, where they were processed. Their role, their motivation, and the degree of their culpability have been subjects of sustained historical and legal debate. What is not debated is that they formed an essential layer of the operational capacity of every Operation Reinhardt site. The broader context within which Operation Reinhardt operated was the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the administrative implementation of what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. Historians debate the degree to which Wannsee was a decision-making meeting versus a coordination meeting. The decisions, many argue, had effectively already been made, and Wannsee was more about aligning the bureaucratic machinery across multiple agencies. What Wannsee established in documented form was that the entire Jewish population of Europe, over 11 million people by the numbers cited in the conference's own protocol, was to be subject to a policy of extermination. Operation Reinhardt was the primary instrument through which that policy was applied to the Jews of occupied Poland. By the time construction at Sobibor was progressing through the early spring of 1942, Belzec had already been killing for weeks. The knowledge flowing back from Belzec, what worked, what needed modification, what logistical problems needed to be solved, shaped the Sobibor design. The railway spur was positioned differently. The processing sequence was refined. The separation between what became known as Camp 1, the prisoner labor zone, and Camp 3, the killing zone, was more deliberate. The planners were, in the most disturbing way, learning. And in the specific and horrible grammar of what they were learning, Sobibor represented an improvement. There is a question that students of this period often ask, and it deserves a direct answer here. Why Poland? Why was the killing infrastructure of the final solution constructed not in Germany itself, but in the occupied East? The answer involves several converging factors. The geographic concentration of Europe's largest Jewish population in Polish territory, the distance from German civilian observation, the existing infrastructure of railway lines that connected hundreds of ghettos and communities, to a small number of terminal points, and, crucially, the deliberate administrative separation of the general government from the Reich proper, which created a legal and bureaucratic space in which actions that would have been more visible inside Germany could be conducted with greater institutional isolation. The forests of eastern Poland were chosen because they were far enough away. That calculation was ultimately wrong, but it took decades to fully prove it wrong. What Operation Reinhard represents in the broader history of the Second World War is not simply a chapter in Holocaust history. It represents the outer edge of what organized state violence, applied with industrial consistency, is capable of in a short period of time. Between the spring of 1942 and the autumn of 1943, roughly 18 months, the three Operation Reinhard camps killed more than 1.5 million people. That figure deserves to be held in the mind without being rushed past. More than 1.5 million human beings in 18 months in 3 sites, by a permanent staff that numbered in the hundreds. The scale of it, the speed of it, the deliberate minimalism of it. These are the things that make Operation Reinhard distinct, even within the horrifying broader record of the Holocaust. Sobibor was the middle child of this program. It was not the first built, and it was not the largest, but it was the one that fought back. Chapter 3, Building Sobibor, Construction, Design, and the first transport's construction at Sobibor began in the early spring of 1942. The site, as noted, had been selected for its isolation and its rail access. But the physical work of turning a forested railway halt into a functioning killing centre required labour, materials, and organisational knowledge that the SS did not simply conjure from nothing. Local Polish civilian workers were recruited or conscripted for the initial construction phases. Jewish labourers from nearby communities were also used. Men who were told they were being employed on a construction project, and who, in most documented accounts, had no clear understanding of what they were building. The final site covered a roughly rectangular area. Sources describe it as measuring approximately 400 meters by 600 meters, enclosed by 3 concentric lines of barbed wire fencing. Watchtowers were positioned at intervals along the perimeter, each elevated high enough to provide sight lines across the interior. The forest immediately adjacent to the perimeter was incorporated into the camp's visual screening. Branches and foliage were threaded into the outer wire, so that from a distance, the fence line was indistinguishable from the tree line. This was not an accidental aesthetic decision. It was a deliberate camouflage technique designed to prevent observation from outside the wire. The internal organization of the camp divided into 3 numbered zones, which historians and survivor testimonies consistently refer to as Camp 1, Camp 2, and Camp 3. Though German administrative documents used different nomenclature, Camp 1 was the outer zone. It contained the main gate, the SS administration building, the barracks for the permanent prisoner workforce, workshops, and the facilities used by the SS and auxiliary guards. This was, in a grotesque sense, the visible camp, the part that deportees first encountered, and the part designed to maintain the deception that they had arrived at a transit or labour facility. Camp 2 was the processing area, the zone through which arriving deportees moved after being separated from their luggage and ordered to undress. It was here that women had their hair cut. The explanation given to deportees was that this was a hygienic procedure before entering a shower. The buildings in this zone were carefully designed to support this deception. They looked, or were meant to look, like the reception facilities of a labour or resettlement camp. The path from Camp 2 toward Camp 3, the killing zone, was a fenced corridor approximately 4 to 5 meters wide, concealed on both sides by woven branches, and referred to in survivor accounts by a name that drips with a particular kind of Nazi bureaucratic irony, the Schlauch, meaning the tube. In some later accounts, this path is also called the Himmelfahrtstrasse, the road to heaven. Camp 3 was the most remote zone of the camp, set furthest from the railway entry point, surrounded by its own screen of trees, and accessible only through the controlled corridor. Inside Camp 3 was the central killing facility, a brick building housing the gas chambers. The original installation contained 3 chambers. Each chamber measured approximately 3.5 meters by 3.5 meters. Small, enclosed, windowless. A diesel engine mounted outside the building generated carbon monoxide, which was piped through the walls into each chamber. Bodies were removed through a second door on the opposite side of the building and initially buried in large excavated pits. The entire killing process, from the arrival of a transport to the clearing of the gas chambers, was designed to take a matter of hours. The first commandant of Sobibor was Franz Stangl, an Austrian SS officer who had come to the camp directly from the T4 program. Stangel's background in T4 was not incidental. It was why he was selected. He had the technical knowledge, the institutional experience, and the psychological disposition that the SS administration required. He arrived at Sobibor in April of 1942, weeks before the camp became fully operational, and he remained in command through the initial killing phase. Later, Stangl would be transferred to Treblinka, a promotion of sorts, given Treblinka's larger operational scale, and his departure from Sobibor marked a transition in the camp's command history. He was eventually tried in West Germany in the late 1960s and convicted of mass murder. He died in a Dusseldorf prison in 1971. The first transports to Sobibor arrived in April of 1942. They came from the immediate surrounding area, from the Lublin district, from Kelm, from communities that had been concentrated into ghettos over the preceding 2 years. The deportees were loaded onto trains, typically cattle cars, sealed and unventilated, and transported to the Sobibor railway spur, where the cars were brought onto the platform inside the camp perimeter. The process of deceiving arriving deportees that they had reached a transit or work facility was highly developed by the time Sobibor opened, drawing on the operational experience already accumulated at Belzec. Camp personnel, in some documented instances wearing white medical coats, announced that new arrivals would undergo delousing and registration before being assigned to work. They were told to tie their shoes together. They were told to remember their camp number. The specificity of these instructions was deliberate. It signaled bureaucracy, which signaled duration, which signaled survival. Between April and July of 1942, the killing operations at Sobibor ran with the mechanical regularity that the planners had designed for. The transports came in groups, typically in trains of approximately 20 railway wagons, which the existing platform could accommodate, and they came from an expanding geographic area. By the summer of 1942, transports were arriving not only from the Lublin district, but from communities in Czechoslovakia, Germany, and Austria, often via transit ghettos in occupied Poland. Estimates of the number killed in this first operational phase vary somewhat between sources, but the figure most consistently cited is approximately 100,000 people killed between May and July of 1942 alone. In August of 1942, operations at Sobibor were interrupted. This interruption is historically significant because it was not caused by resistance or disruption from within. It was caused by infrastructure. The main railway line serving the camp required repair and upgrading, and during the weeks that the track was out of service, no transports arrived. The SS used this pause not only to repair the rail line, but to expand the killing capacity of Camp 3. The original 3 gas chambers were augmented by an additional 3 chambers, bringing the total to 6. The new chambers were larger. The expanded facility could, according to multiple historical accounts, process approximately 1,200 people simultaneously. When operations resumed in October of 1942, Sobibor was a more efficient killing site than it had been when it shut down. The question of what the permanent prisoner workforce, the Jews kept alive to perform the labor that kept the camp functioning, understood about the nature of the place they were in, is one of the most complicated and painful questions in Sobibor's history. The documentary and testimonial evidence is clear that within a short time of their arrival, most of the approximately 600 permanent prisoner workers understood the function of Camp 3. How could they not? They cleaned the railway platform after each transport. They sorted the luggage and clothing of people who never appeared again. Some of them worked in Camp 3 itself. The psychological weight of this knowledge, the moral impossibility of the position they were in, and the ways in which people navigated, or could not navigate, that position is a thread that will run through every chapter that follows. For now, it is enough to establish this. By the end of 1942, Sobibor was fully operational, expanding and surrounded by a silence that the men who built it believed was permanent. Chapter 4. Life and Death Inside. The wire, the prisoner workforce, and the machinery of daily existence. There is a temptation, when writing about a killing center, to reduce the human beings inside it to their deaths, to move quickly through the operational mechanics and arrive at the numbers. I want to resist that temptation carefully, because the 600 or so people who were held inside Sobibor as a permanent prisoner workforce were not simply components of the killing operation. They were people. People with specific skills, specific histories, specific relationships with one another. And the texture of their daily existence inside Sobibor matters enormously to understanding what eventually happened there. The prisoner workforce at Sobibor was organized into work teams called commandos. Each commando had a specific function. There were platform workers who unloaded and cleaned the railway cars between transports, sorting workers who processed the belongings of the murdered, carpenters and tailors and cobblers who performed skilled labor for the use of the SS staff, and the workers of Camp 3 itself, who were kept isolated from the rest of the prisoner population and bore the most direct and immediate contact with the killing operation. The separation between these different groups was deliberately maintained by the SS, physically, in terms of where each group was quartered, and socially, in terms of the information that flowed between them. The skilled worker commandos, the tailors, the carpenters, the goldsmiths, the mechanics, occupied a particularly strange position in the camp's social structure. They were, in a technical sense, valued. Their skills were useful to the SS staff, and this utility gave them a marginal and entirely contingent form of protection. Franz Stangl and later commandants wore suits made by the tailors. Furniture was built by the carpenters for the SS quarters. Jewelry sorted from the belongings of the murdered was processed by the goldsmiths. This dependency created a perverse form of relationship between some prisoners and some SS personnel. Not friendship, not equality, but a transactional acknowledgement of usefulness that could, on a given day, be the difference between being kept alive and being shot. The Ukrainian auxiliary guards, the Tronikis, occupied yet another layer of this social structure. Their relationship to both the SS officers and the prisoner populations was complicated by their own ambiguous position. They were not German nationals. Many had entered service under coercive conditions. They were paid and given certain privileges, but were also subjected to violent discipline by the SS officers above them. Some of the most consistent brutality documented in survivor testimonies is attributed to specific Ukrainian guards. But there are also accounts of individual guards who, on specific occasions, showed restraint or even provided small acts of assistance to individual prisoners. The historical record on this point is genuinely mixed, and any account that presents the Troniki guards as a uniform category is probably simplifying a more complicated reality. Food within the permanent prisoner compound was inadequate by design. The caloric allocation was not calculated to sustain health over the long term. It was calculated to maintain short-term functional capacity in people whose long-term survival was, from the perspective of the camp administration, always conditional. Prisoners supplemented their official rations through various means. Items smuggled from the sorting commandos, exchanges with guards, food hidden within the camp. The risk of being caught with unauthorized food was severe, and the punishments were arbitrary and brutal. This creates one of the consistent psychological features of life in the camp: the state of permanent, managed uncertainty. You did not know on any given morning whether the day would end as the previous day had ended. The social organization that the prisoners themselves built within these constraints is one of the less examined aspects of Sobibor's history, partly because survivor testimony is relatively sparse. The number of people who survived Sobibor and were able to provide detailed accounts is small, and not all of those accounts have been translated into English or widely circulated. What the existing testimony does make clear is that the permanent prisoner community was not a uniform mass. There were hierarchies within it, between those who had been in the camp longer and those who had just arrived, between those in relatively protected positions in the skilled worker commandos, and those in the more dangerous and psychologically devastating positions in Camp 3, between those of different national origins and different social backgrounds. One of the more significant dynamics in this community was the distinction between Polish Jews and Jews from Western Europe. From the spring of 1943 onward, transports began arriving from the Netherlands, from France, from Germany. Communities that had until recently been living in relatively normalized circumstances, who arrived at Sobibor without the accumulated survival knowledge of the Polish Jews who had already been living under occupation for 3 years. The Polish Jewish prisoners, particularly those who had survived in the camp for months, had a kind of grim situational expertise. They knew the routines, knew which guards were most dangerous, knew the unwritten rules that governed survival. The Western European arrivals did not have this knowledge, and the gap in experience created both friction and, in some cases, a kind of informal mentoring. The physical condition of the camp itself changed over time in ways that reflected the SS administration's evolving priorities. In late 1942 and through 1943, as the volume of deportees increased, so did the material flowing into the sorting sheds: clothing, luggage, jewelry, currency, personal documents. The sorting and processing of this material required skilled labor, which reinforced the functional value of keeping certain prisoners alive. But the same period also saw the SS administration become increasingly concerned about the security implications of maintaining a large, experienced prisoner workforce that had been inside the camp long enough to understand its complete operational structure. This tension between the practical need for skilled prisoner labor and the security risk that knowledgeable prisoners represented was never fully resolved, and it would ultimately prove fatal to the camp's continuation. Punishments within Sobibor ranged from the formally administered public floggings at roll call to the entirely arbitrary. Prisoners could be shot for infractions as minor as possessing unauthorized food, being in the wrong location within the camp, or simply attracting the attention of a guard in a bad mood on a bad day. This unpredictability was not entirely a byproduct of individual cruelty. It was structurally functional, because a prisoner population that could never predict the consequences of any given action was a prisoner population in a state of managed psychological paralysis. The application of violence was most intense during the arrival of transports. When the SS and guards needed maximum compliance from the arriving deportees and maximum performance from the prisoner workforce handling the process. Against all of this, the inadequate food, the forced proximity to mass death, the arbitrary violence, the psychological impossibility of the position they were in, the permanent prisoner community at Sobibor sustained forms of human connection that the camp's design was explicitly intended to eliminate. People formed relationships, some fell in love, people told stories, observed religious occasions when it was safe to do so, shared food when they could. None of this is romantic or redemptive in any easy sense. It is simply what human beings do when systems try to reduce them to their function. And it is precisely this residual human complexity, this irreducible personhood, that would eventually become, in the hands of specific individuals, at a specific moment, the foundation of something the camp's designers had not accounted for. Chapter 5. The Commandants and the Killers. The S personnel of Sobibor, Franz Stangl, left Sobibor in the late summer of 1942 to take command of Treblinka, and his departure marked a transitional period in the camp's command history. He was replaced, after a brief interim period, by Franz Reichleitner, who commanded Sobibor through most of its remaining operational life. Reichleitner was, in the historical record, a less well-documented figure than Stangl, partly because he did not survive the war to be tried, and to give the extensive testimony that Stangl eventually provided. What is known about Reichleitner is largely reconstructed from the testimonies of survivors and from documents produced by the camp's SS staff. He was, by most accounts, a man who ran the camp with functional detachment rather than Stangl's more active personal involvement in the operational details. The SS officer corps at Sobibor was drawn almost entirely from the T4 program. This is a point worth emphasizing because it explains a great deal about the specific culture of the camp. T4, formerly known as Action T4, was the Nazi program that organized the killing of German and Austrian citizens with physical or intellectual disabilities between 1939 and 1941. The program was ostensibly halted in August of 1941, following protests from Catholic bishops in Germany. Protests that represent one of the very few instances of organized public opposition to a Nazi policy within Germany itself during the war. When T4 was officially suspended, its personnel, who had developed methods of killing with carbon monoxide and had been psychologically conditioned to participate in institutionalized mass death, were reassigned to Operation Reinhard. They did not need to be trained for Sobibor. They were already trained. This lineage matters because it complicates the usual narrative of Holocaust perpetrators as ideologically possessed fanatics driven purely by anti-Semitism. Many of the T4 veterans who staffed Operation Reinhard camps were not primarily motivated by anti-Jewish ideology in the way that the historians of earlier generations sometimes assumed. They were, in many cases, motivated by careerism, by institutional loyalty, by the particular moral numbness that seems to develop in people who perform organized killing as a professional function over an extended period of time. The historian Christopher Browning's research on perpetrator psychology, most famously in his work on Reserve Police Battalion 101, suggests that the mechanisms of conformity, peer pressure, and incremental normalization played a larger role in enabling the Holocaust than the simple presence or absence of ideological conviction. The SS men of Sobibor are, in many respects, a case study in this argument. The most documented individual SS officer at Sobibor, beyond the two commandants, is Johann Niemann, who held the position of deputy commandant during the camp's final months of operation. Niemann is significant in the historical record both because of the role he played in the day-to-day administration of the camp and because of his fate on the 14th of October, 1943. But we will arrive at that day in a later chapter. What matters here is what Niemann's documented behavior inside Sobibor tells us about the culture of the SS staff. He was described in survivor testimonies as a man capable of casual brutality, violence administered without apparent passion, as a routine management tool, but also as a man who participated in the ordinary social life of the SS quarters. Meals, conversation, the dull bureaucratic paperwork that accompanied even the most extraordinary crimes. The relationship between the SS officers and the Ukrainian auxiliary guards was hierarchical, but not straightforwardly straightforward. The Trauniki men were paid considerably less than the SS officers, were housed separately, were subject to German military discipline, and were explicitly treated as a lesser category of personnel within the camp's internal culture. But they also performed the most physically proximate aspects of the guard function: patrolling the perimeter, managing prisoner movement during transport arrivals, and providing the human presence that prevented escape on a daily basis. The SS officers supervised and directed, the Traunikis executed. This division of labor had both practical and psychological dimensions. It distributed the most visible forms of violence across a larger number of people, which had the effect of distributing the psychological burden and the potential for post-war accountability. One of the more unsettling aspects of the SS personnel record at Sobibor and at the Operation Reinhard camps in general is the degree to which normal life continued alongside the killing. The SS staff kept pets, they organized sports competitions, they maintained gardens near their quarters, they received packages from home, wrote letters, took leave in Germany, and returned. This coexistence of ordinary domestic life and mass killing is not something that hindsight makes easier to understand, and historians have grappled with it at length. It is important not to use it to suggest that the perpetrators were unknowing, or that their actions were somehow unconscious. They were fully aware of what they were doing. The domestic normalcy was not evidence of ignorance. It was evidence of compartmentalization, of a moral adaptations so complete that it ceased to register as adaptation. There were, within the SS staff, individuals who showed what might be described as degrees of relative restraint, who did not initiate gratuitous violence, who did not seek out opportunities for cruelty beyond what the camp's operational function required. Survivor testimonies occasionally note specific SS men who behaved with what passes in the context of a death camp for decency, not beating prisoners without specific cause, occasionally providing small amounts of food, looking away from minor infractions. It would be a serious moral error to use these individual variations to relativize the collective guilt of the SS staff at Sobibor. Every member of that staff knew the function of Camp 3. Every member participated in its operation. But the variations are historically documented, and ignoring them would be a different kind of inaccuracy. The SS administration's handling of what they called the Jewish workforce problem evolved over time in ways that directly shaped the eventual uprising. In the early months of the camp, the permanent prisoner workforce was in a state of relatively high turnover. People who had been kept alive for their skills were periodically killed and replaced with new arrivals. But by 1943, a degree of stabilization had occurred, partly because the skill sets the SS needed were specific enough that experienced workers were harder to replace than initially calculated. This stabilization meant that by the spring and summer of 1943, there was a prisoner workforce that had been in the camp for months. People who knew the camp's layout, its personnel, its routines, and its weaknesses. By July of 1943, Himmler had visited Sobibor and issued an order that would become one of the most consequential decisions in the camp's history. He directed that Sobibor be converted from a killing center into a concentration camp, to be used for the storage and processing of captured ammunition. For the permanent prisoner workforce, This directive carried an obvious implication. If Sobibor was to be repurposed, its existing prisoner population, the people who knew everything about what had happened there, were a security liability. The conversion order was, in the understanding of the people who received it indirectly through the camp's information networks, effectively a death sentence. This understanding was not paranoid speculation. It was an accurate reading of how Operation Reinhard camps handled their prisoner workforces when they were no longer needed. The SS men of Sobibor believed, with justification based on everything they had observed about the prisoner population's behavior to that point, that they had created conditions under which organized resistance was impossible. The prisoners were isolated. They were physically weakened. They were psychologically subjected to constant, arbitrary violence. They were separated into commandos with limited intergroup communication. They had no weapons. They had no outside connections. Every calculation that the SS administration had made about the controllability of the Sobibor prisoner workforce was rational given the information they had. What they had not calculated for was the arrival, in September of 1943, of a particular group of men from a particular transport. Men who brought with them a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of training, and a willingness to act that would change everything. Chapter 6. The transports, where the trains came from and who was on them. The railway was the nervous system of the final solution. Without the trains, without the logistical infrastructure of rolling stock and scheduling, and the cooperation of the Reich Railway Authority, the Reichsbahn, the killing centres of Operation Reinhard could not have functioned. This is a point that historians of the Holocaust have documented with considerable precision, and it matters because it distributes the chain of complicity far beyond the perimeter of any individual camp. The men who scheduled the transports, the officials who negotiated the use of railway capacity, the drivers and guards who accompanied the trains. These were not marginal figures. They were structural components of the killing operation. At Sobibor, the transports arrived by a dedicated railway spur that branched from the main Chelm-Lodauer line and terminated inside the camp perimeter, at the platform in Camp 1's reception area. The spur could accommodate approximately 20 railway wagons at a time, which determined the typical transport size, and therefore the operational rhythm of the camp. When a transport arrived, the process of reception, the euphemism that appears in German administrative language, moved at a pace calibrated to prevent the emerging of group awareness among the deportees. Speed was a security tool. Confusion was a management technique. The geographic range of the transports to Sobibor expanded steadily from the camp's opening in April of 1942 through its final months of operation in late 1943. The initial transports came from the immediately adjacent Lublin district, communities like Kelm, Wolodawa, and the smaller towns of the surrounding area. These were people who had been living under German occupation since 1939, who had already experienced 3 years of progressive restriction, ghetto confinement, and forced labor. Their deportation to Sobibor was, in many cases, the final stage of a process that had been escalating for years. By the summer of 1942, the transport network had expanded to bring deportees from Czechoslovakia, from Germany, and from Austria, often via transit points in the occupied Polish ghettos, rather than directly from their communities of origin. The presence of German and Austrian Jews in the Sobibor transports is an aspect of the camp's history that sometimes surprises people whose mental image of the Holocaust centers on Eastern European Jewry. The deportees from Germany and Austria had, in many cases, experienced the progressive restrictions of Nazi anti-Jewish policy since 1933, nearly a decade of escalating persecution before being deported to the East. The year 1943 brought the most geographically diverse transports in Sobibor's operational history. In March of that year, the first transports of French Jews arrived. Between March and July of 1943, 19 transports from the Netherlands brought approximately 35,000 Dutch Jews to Sobibor. The Dutch transports are particularly well documented in the historical record, partly because Dutch civil records were exceptionally thorough, and partly because the post-war investigations in the Netherlands were extensive. The transport manifests, the lists of names, ages, and points of origin that the Reichsbahn required for all troop and civilian movements, survive in several Dutch and German archives, and they allow historians to reconstruct with more precision than is possible for the Polish transports, who was on the trains and where they came from. The Dutch deportees arrived at Sobibor in a condition that reflected the specific deception employed by the German authorities in the Netherlands. They had been told, with varying degrees of specificity, depending on the transport and the period, that they were being resettled for labour in the East. Some had packed for a long journey. Some had brought tools of their trades. A 6-year-old girl named Leah Judith de la Penha arrived from Holland. Her name is known to us today because an engraved metal identification tag bearing her name was recovered by the Israeli archaeologist Yoram Haimi during excavations at the Sobibor site in the early 2000s. She was, by all documentary evidence, killed upon arrival. She was 6 years old. Her identification tag is one of the very few physical objects that gives an individual name to the statistical mass of Sobibor's victims. The transports from the Soviet territories in the camp's final months of operation introduced a different population. By the late summer of 1943, as German forces continued to struggle on the Eastern Front and the ghettos of occupied Soviet territory were being liquidated, transports began arriving at Sobibor, carrying Jews from Vilna, Minsk, and Lida, communities in what is today Lithuania and Belarus. These deportees had, in many cases, already survived years of active ghetto resistance, had connections to partisan networks, and had a different relationship to the idea of armed resistance than the Western European deportees. Crucially, among the transports from Soviet territory in September of 1943 came a group of approximately 80 Jewish men who had been captured as soldiers of the Red Army. The transport of Soviet Jewish prisoners of war in September of 1943 was unusual in several respects. Prisoners of war who were Jewish occupied a particularly complex and dangerous position in the German war prisoner system. They were subject to both the Soviet Palgo regime, which was brutally harsh for all Soviet prisoners, and the additional targeting that came with being Jewish. The group that arrived at Sobibor in late September of 1943 included men who had served as officers, men who had received military training, men who had experienced combat and organized violence in a context that the existing Sobibor prisoner workforce had not. Among them was a junior officer named Alexander Pechersky, a Soviet lieutenant whose name will become central to everything that follows. The moment of a transport's arrival at Sobibor is described in multiple survivor testimonies, with a consistency that suggests a standardized procedure. The cattle cars were opened. Camp personnel, sometimes in medical coats, sometimes in regular SS uniform, sometimes relying on the Ukrainian guards, directed people onto the platform. Announcements were made in German and, depending on the origin of the transport, in Yiddish, Polish, Dutch, or French. People were told to leave their luggage on the platform, that it would be delivered to them at their assigned barracks. They were told to remember the number of the rack on which they hung their coats. The specificity of these instructions, the coat rack number, the luggage delivery, was deliberately chosen to create the impression of an organized, duration-implying bureaucracy. This impression was necessary because the maintaining of order depended on it. and any large-scale disruption at the platform was the scenario the SS most wanted to avoid. For the overwhelming majority of the people who arrived at Sobibor, the transport was the end. The deception held long enough for the operational sequence to proceed. There are documented cases of deportees who understood or suspected what was happening, who had received information from others in their communities, who recognized signs that contradicted the official story. But the structural conditions at the platform, the shock of arrival after days in sealed cattle cars, the separation of families, the noise and movement, and the simple impossibility of acting on individual knowledge within a crowd under armed guard. These conditions prevented the kind of collective response that might have changed the outcome. This is not a judgment on the deportees. It is a description of a system that was specifically engineered to prevent exactly that response. The total number of people who died at Sobibor is estimated by most historical sources at approximately 250,000. The majority of them Jews from Poland, with substantial numbers from the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France, Czechoslovakia, and the occupied Soviet territories. Some historical studies place the figure somewhat higher. The methodology for estimating totals at the Operation Reinhard camps is complicated by the deliberate destruction of records and the absence of any prisoner registration system. What is not in dispute is the order of magnitude. In a little over a year and a half of operation, in a small camp in a Polish forest, 250,000 people were killed. And then, on the 14th of October 1943, the trains that had been feeding this camp for 18 months became, for the first time, a secondary concern. Because the people inside the wire had decided that the silence was going to end. Chapter 7. The First Whispers. How resistance begins in impossible places. Resistance does not begin with weapons. It does not begin with a plan, or a leader, or a meeting in a darkened corner of a barracks. It begins earlier than all of that, in a quieter and more fragile place. In the decision made by an individual human being under conditions of extreme duress, to keep paying attention, to notice things, to remember them, to share them with someone else. This is the form that resistance first took Sobibor, and understanding it requires resisting the dramatic instinct to skip ahead to the moment of action. The months before the 14th of October, 1943, were not simply a prelude. They were the substance, the slow, painful, dangerous accumulation of knowledge, trust, and nerve that made everything else possible. The structural conditions inside Sobibor in the first half of 1943 were, as we have established, designed to make collective action impossible. The commando system separated prisoners into functional groups with limited authorized contact between them. The arbitrary violence of the SS and Trauniki guards created an environment in which forming relationships outside your immediate work group was risky, and in which any sustained or secretive communication could attract lethal attention. The deliberate psychological weight of proximity to mass death, of knowing what happened in Camp 3, of being forced to participate at some level in the operational mechanics of the place, created conditions of trauma that, in most historical accounts of similar situations, tend toward passivity rather than organization. The camp's designers understood all of this. They had built these conditions deliberately, and yet the permanent prisoner workforce at Sobibor included, by the spring of 1943, individuals who had survived inside the camp for over a year. These were people who had not been killed in the periodic selections, the periodic purges of the prisoner workforce, in which the SS removed those they deemed no longer useful or too knowledgeable. Their survival to this point was not random luck alone. Many had survived because they possessed specific skills the camp required, but also because they had developed the situational intelligence to navigate the camp's internal social landscape, to understand which guards were most dangerous, which SS officers were most volatile, which routines could be exploited, and which could not be broken without lethal consequence. This kind of situational intelligence is, in a camp context, a form of accumulated power. Among the prisoners who had developed this kind of knowledge was a man named Leon Feldhendler. Feldhendler was a Polish Jew from the town of Zolkiewka in the Lublin district. Before the war, his father had been the rabbi of the local Jewish community, and Feldhendler himself had been active in the local Jewish self-governing body, the Judenrat, not as a collaborator in the worst sense of that word, but as a community organizer, a man experienced in negotiating between competing interests and managing group dynamics under pressure. He had arrived at Sobibor and survived through a combination of genuine skill, careful observation, and the particular social intelligence of someone who had spent years in community leadership. By the summer of 1943, Feldhendler had begun, very carefully and very quietly, to think about organized resistance, the challenge that Feldhendler faced, and that any potential organizer of resistance at Sobibor would have faced, was not principally ideological. It was not a question of whether to resist. For anyone who had been inside Sobibor long enough to understand what happened in Camp 3, the moral imperative was clear. The challenge was practical and almost paralyzing in its complexity. A successful escape or uprising required a sufficient number of people who were willing to act. It required some form of coordination across the commando boundaries that the SS had established precisely to prevent such coordination. It required, ideally, someone with military training, someone who knew not just how to organize people emotionally and socially, but how to plan and execute a physical operation under fire. And it required timing, a moment when the odds of success, however terrible, were better than the certainty of death that was coming anyway. The question of timing was sharpened in the summer of 1943 by two converging developments. The first was Himmler's order, discussed in the previous chapter, that Sobibor be converted into an ammunition storage facility. This directive filtered through the prisoner community, not as an official announcement, but as accumulated inference. A pattern of changes in the camp's administration, in the behavior of certain SS personnel, in the kinds of work the prisoner workforce was being assigned. The second development was the liquidation of the Treblinka uprising in August of 1943. The prisoners at Treblinka had risen on the 2nd of August, 1943. They had obtained weapons from the camp's armory and mounted a full-scale revolt. Hundreds escaped. Treblinka was subsequently shut down. News of the Treblinka uprising reached Sobibor through the channels of information that persisted despite the camp's isolation. Guards who talked, bits of overheard conversation, the fragmentary intelligence that any alert and desperate population develops. The Treblinka uprising showed that organized armed resistance was possible. It also showed that Sobibor's window of possibility was closing. Feldhendler's early organizing efforts were constrained by a clear strategic problem. The permanent prisoner workforce at Sobibor, despite its collective experience, did not contain enough people with military and combat experience to plan and execute a physical operation against armed guards. The commando workers were tailors, carpenters, farmers, merchants. People whose survival skills were real, but whose experience of organized violence was limited. Feldhendler understood this. He was building something, but he knew that what he was building was incomplete, without a different kind of expertise. The question of where that expertise would come from was answered, with the particular bitter irony of this history, by the Germans themselves, by the decision, made somewhere in the administrative chain of the SS, to send a transport of Soviet Jewish prisoners of war to Sobibor in the late summer of 1943. The information networks within Sobibor that allowed resistance organizing to develop, however slowly and dangerously, deserve specific attention because they represent one of the most remarkable human achievements of the camp's history, and one that is often passed over quickly in the rush to get to the uprising itself. The networks were not formal structures. They were informal systems, built on trust, built through the small daily interactions that the commando structure did not completely prevent. The moment when a skilled worker from Camp 1 crossed paths with a platform worker, when a sorting commando worker passed a message, along with a piece of clothing, when a prisoner in a relatively trusted position with an SS officer used that proximity to gather information and pass it laterally. These were not heroic gestures in the cinematic sense. They were small, risky human acts of connection that collectively constituted an intelligence-gathering apparatus operating inside one of the most controlled environments in the history of organized killing. There is a temptation, in writing about resistance in environments like Sobibor, to frame it as exceptional, to treat the people who organized it as extraordinary in some innate way that separates them from the majority who did not organize. This framing is both psychologically comforting and historically inaccurate. The people who organized resistance at Sobibor were not different in kind from those who did not. They were, in most cases, people who had arrived at a particular combination of circumstances, the right skills, the right position in the camp's social structure, enough time to have accumulated the necessary knowledge, and enough physical and psychological resilience remaining to act on that knowledge. The people who did not organize were not failures or cowards. They were people who, under conditions of extreme duress, responded in the way that most human beings respond, with the primary goal of surviving another day. Both responses are human. Neither deserves retrospective judgment. By the time Leon Feldhendler had developed the outlines of an organizational network within the camp, a network whose membership was small, whose meetings were invisible to the camp administration, and whose purpose was as yet undefined in operational terms. The summer of 1943 was turning toward autumn. The transports continued. The killing continued. The camp's daily rhythm of horror continued, and from the outside it looked exactly as it had always looked. Controlled, functional, silent. But inside the wire, in the conversations that happened between trusted individuals, in the brief margins of daily life that the SS could not fully monitor, something was accumulating. Not quite a plan, not yet, but the foundation of a plan, a shared understanding that the time was coming, that the attempt would have to be made, and that what was needed was someone who knew how to turn a shared understanding into a sequence of executable actions. Chapter 8. Pechersky arrives. The Soviet officer and the question of leadership. Alexander Aronovich Pechersky was 34 years old when he arrived at Sobibor. He was born in 1909 in Kremenchug, in what is today Ukraine, and had grown up in Rostov-on-Don, in southern Russia, where he had worked as an administrator in a theatrical organization before the war. He was not a career military officer. He had been drafted into the Red Army when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. But by the autumn of 1943, he had experienced more than 2 years of the war's most brutal realities: combat, capture, imprisonment in conditions of extreme deprivation, the specific targeting that Jewish Soviet soldiers faced in German captivity, and survival through a series of circumstances that had stripped away most of the comfortable assumptions a person carries about the predictability of the world. He arrived at Sobibor on the 23rd of September, 1943, as part of a transport from the Minsk region, carrying approximately 80 Jewish men who had been Red Army soldiers. The moment of Pechersky's arrival at Sobibor is described in the memoir he wrote after the war and in the testimonies of survivors who witnessed it. The reception procedure, the deceptive announcements, the luggage left on the platform, the directions to the processing area, was the same as for every other transport. But the SS administration at Sobibor, familiar enough with the processing of deportees from across Europe, apparently had some uncertainty about how to classify a group of men who were simultaneously Jewish deportees and former Soviet military personnel. The group was initially held in a transitional status, not immediately sent through the processing sequence that ended in Camp 3, but kept in the prisoner reception area while the camp administration worked out what to do with them. This delay, a bureaucratic hesitation, saved their lives. The decision was eventually made to incorporate them into the permanent prisoner workforce. Pechersky's physical presence in the camp, in the days immediately following his arrival, was noted by the existing prisoner community in ways that survivor testimonies describe with consistent specificity. He was physically imposing, tall, lean, carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone who has been trained to manage fear. More practically, he behaved in ways that were immediately distinctive within the Sobibor prisoner culture. He maintained eye contact with SS personnel in ways that other prisoners did not. He refused small acts of compliance that most prisoners had learned were the safest default behavior. And he displayed, when tested by individual guards, a kind of controlled non-submission that was genuinely anomalous in the camp's social environment. These behaviors were, from a strictly rational survival perspective, dangerous, but they were read by the existing prisoner community, and particularly by Leon Feldhendler, who became aware of Pechersky quickly as evidence of exactly the kind of temperament that the resistance network needed. The first contact between Feldhendler and Pechersky is described in survivor accounts as cautious and indirect, which is exactly what it should have been, given that a premature disclosure of the resistance network's existence to someone who turned out to be an informer would have been instantly lethal for everyone involved. Feldhendler's approach appears to have been gradual. An initial assessment of Pechersky through observation, followed by small tests of trust, followed by careful disclosure through intermediaries before any direct conversation about resistance. Pechersky's own account of this period describes a man who was already independently assessing the camp's physical layout and personnel structure with the systematic attention of someone considering escape, and who recognized in Feldhendler's approach the existence of an organizational structure he could work with. The partnership that emerged between Feldhendler and Pechersky was one of the most effective instances of complementary leadership under extreme duress in the documented history of Holocaust resistance. Feldhendler brought the internal knowledge, the map of the camp's social and physical structure, the existing network of trusted prisoners, the understanding of which individuals could be relied on and which could not, and the political intelligence to manage the complex dynamics of a prisoner community drawn from multiple countries and backgrounds. Pechersky brought the military expertise, the ability to assess a physical objective, to plan a sequential operation, to think about timing and coordination and contingency. Neither could have done what they did without the other. The historical record on this partnership is clear on this point, even though, for reasons that are worth examining, Pechersky's name tends to dominate the post-war narrative of the uprising, while Feldhendler's role has sometimes been underweighted. The reason for this imbalance in historical memory is, in part, a function of survival and documentation. Pechersky survived the war. He wrote a memoir, gave extensive interviews, and was a living witness whose account could be gathered and cross-referenced by historians. Feldhendler survived the uprising and the war, but was killed in the immediate post-war period in April of 1945, in violence connected to the anti-Jewish atmosphere that persisted in parts of Poland even after liberation. His death meant that his own account of the planning process, his perspective on what he had built inside the camp over the months before Pechersky arrived, was never documented in direct, extended form that Pechersky's account was. This is a historiographical fact, not a conspiracy. But it is a fact that should make readers of the Sobibor story careful about assuming that the person whose name appears most prominently in the record was necessarily the person who did the most work. Pechersky's assessment of the camp's defenses, conducted through careful observation in the weeks following his arrival, produced a set of conclusions that shaped the entire planning of the uprising. The perimeter was guarded but not impregnable. The watchtowers provided elevated sightlines, but the guards in them were not uniformly attentive at all times, and there were moments in the daily routine when the distribution of guard personnel created relative vulnerabilities at specific points of the perimeter. The internal movement of the SS officers between the different zones of the camp followed predictable patterns, patterns that could, in principle, be exploited to isolate individual officers at specific times and locations. The existing prisoner workforce, distributed across multiple commandos, had tools as part of their daily work. Knives, axes, scissors, items used in the workshops, that were not formally weapons, but could function as weapons if the plan required it. None of this added up to an easy operation, but it added up to a possible one. The question of how many prisoners to involve in the planning, and at what stage to disclose the plan to a wider group, was one of the most delicate decisions Pechersky and Feldhendler faced. Involving too few people meant insufficient operational capacity on the day. Involving too many, too early, increased the risk of a premature disclosure, whether through an informer, through a breakdown under psychological pressure, or simply through the compounding probability of a slip that comes with each additional person who holds a secret. The solution they arrived at was a tight inner circle of planners, perhaps a dozen people at most, who knew the full outline of the plan, with a broader group who would be informed of their specific role and timing only on the day itself. This structure minimized the disclosure risk, while ensuring that enough people understood enough to act when the moment came. Pechersky's account of his own psychological state during the planning period describes something that does not easily fit the heroic narrative that later attached to his name. He was frightened. He was uncertain. He was making calculations about the probability of survival that he knew were heavily weighted against him and everyone around him. He describes lying awake at night, running through the plan's failure modes, the ways in which it could go wrong, the variables he could not control, the lives that depend on decisions he was making with incomplete information. This is not the psychology of a cinematic action hero. It is the psychology of an intelligent, conscientious person in an impossible situation, doing the best available thinking under conditions that precluded certainty. It is arguably the more honest and the more instructive portrait. The final shape of the plan that Pechersky and Feldhendler arrived at, the plan that would be executed on the 14th of October, 1943, emerged from a process of revision and refinement that extended through most of October. Earlier drafts had included elements that were subsequently discarded as too risky or too dependent on variables outside the planner's control. A plan involving the camp's armory, a direct seizure of weapons, was considered and rejected when it became clear that the armory's access points were too well monitored. A plan for a mass rush of the perimeter wire was considered and revised when Pechersky judged the casualties from watchtower fire would be too great without prior action against the SS personnel. What emerged was something more methodical, more cold-blooded, and more dependent on the particular discipline and nerve of a small group of people than any plan that relied on mass momentum alone. It was the plan of men who understood that in the situation they were in, The only form of hope that was worth anything was the kind you built yourself, piece by piece, in the time you had available. Chapter 9. The Plan. 48 hours before the 14th. The plan that Pechersky and Feldendler finalized for the 14th of October, 1943, was, in its essential architecture, a sequence of contained actions designed to create an irreversible change in the camp's balance of power before anyone outside the inner planning circle understood what was happening. It was not a plan for a frontal assault. It was not a plan for a mass rush. It was a plan for systematic elimination of the camp's SS officer corps, one by one, in separate locations, within a window of approximately 60 to 90 minutes, after which the prisoner workforce would have a brief period in which the camp's command structure was destroyed, and the remaining guards would be numerically insufficient to contain a mass movement toward the perimeter. The plan was audacious to the point of implausibility. It was also, given the constraints, the most rational option available. The sequence worked as follows in its conceptual design. Individual SS officers were to be lured, one at a time, into the workshops and workspaces of the skilled worker commandos, under the pretext of legitimate business. An officer being invited to view a new uniform, to be fitted for boots, to inspect a piece of furniture. Once isolated inside a workshop with a small number of prisoners, the officer would be killed. The killing was to be done silently, with the tools available in the workshops. Knives, axes, the implements of the trades being performed. The body was to be hidden, and the next officer was to be invited, before the absence of the previous one was noticed. The goal was to kill as many of the SS officer corps as possible before the alarm was raised, after which the plan would shift from the covert phase to the overt phase. The prisoners would gather on the roll call square, Pechersky would address them, and the group would move together toward the armory to obtain weapons, then toward the perimeter wire. The timing of the 14th of October, a Wednesday, was not accidental. The camp's operational calendar had rhythms and regularities, and the planners had identified that particular day as one when a combination of factors would be relatively favorable. The afternoon hour, approximately 3 o'clock, after the midday meal, when the SS officers' daily routine brought them to a sequence of locations that could be predicted and exploited, when the Traniki Guard's afternoon rotation would create a specific distribution of personnel, and when the remaining daylight hours after the planned breakout would give the escapees enough light to move through the surrounding forest before darkness fell. These calculations were not precise in the way that a military staff plan would be precise. They were based on observation and inference, not on a formal intelligence product, but they were careful, and they reflected the kind of detailed environmental awareness that months of desperate attention had produced. The inner circle of planners, the people who knew the full outline of what was to happen, numbered perhaps 10 to 15 individuals drawn from different commandos. Each was responsible for a specific component of the operation. Specific officers who would be lured into specific workshops at specific times. The people who would perform the killing. The people who would manage the concealment of the bodies. The people who would ensure that the prisoner workforce in their respective areas was positioned correctly for the overt phase. The coordination required across this group, without the benefit of written communication, and with the constant risk of observation by guards, is one of the most remarkable aspects of the plan's development. It was achieved through a combination of face-to-face communication in the brief unobserved moments of the daily routine, and through the informal information networks that Feldhendler had spent months developing. The breadth of the plan's inclusion, the question of how much to tell the broader prisoner population and when, was a source of genuine debate within the inner circle, based on the survivor accounts. Some members of the planning group argued for broader disclosure earlier, on the grounds that prisoners who were surprised by the events of the 14th might react with panic, confusion, or a paralysis that would undermine the overt phase. Others argued that earlier, broader disclosure increased the risk of the plan being exposed before it could be executed. Pechersky's position, as reflected in his memoir, was that the broad prisoner population would be informed only on the afternoon of the 14th itself. At the roll call square, after the covert phase had already altered the balance of power sufficiently that the disclosure could not be stopped by the remaining camp personnel. This was a cold calculation, and it meant that the majority of the 600 prisoners inside Sobibor on the 14th of October did not know what was about to happen until it was already happening. One of the specific and painful complications in the plan's design was the question of Camp 3, the prisoners held in the killing zone, isolated from the rest of the camp by the physical and administrative barriers the SS had constructed. These were the people who worked in the most immediate proximity to the gas chambers, who lived in the most complete separation from the rest of the prisoner workforce, and whose knowledge of the camp's function was the most immediate and the most devastating. Communication with Camp 3 prisoners in the planning phase was limited by the physical barriers between zones, and there is genuine historical uncertainty about how much the Camp 3 workers knew of the plan before the 14th. Several survivor accounts suggest that attempts were made to pass information to Camp 3 in the days before the uprising, but the degree to which those attempts succeeded remains unclear. The weapons available to the plan were, by any conventional military assessment, woefully inadequate. The workshops of the skilled worker, commandos, contained knives used by the cobblers, axes used by the carpenters, and various other edged tools. There were no firearms in the possession of the prisoner workforce at the start of the planning period. The acquisition of firearms was identified as a goal of the overt phase, through the seizure of the camp armory, rather than a precondition of the covert phase. This meant that the first hour of the operation, the systematic luring and killing of individual SS officers, had to be accomplished without firearms, against men who were themselves armed with pistols, and who would, if they had a moment to use them, reverse the entire dynamic instantly. The plan required its executors to be faster, quieter, and more controlled than the situation created any natural inclination to be. In the 48 hours before the 14th of October, the people with knowledge of the plan lived in a condition of compressed time that several survivor accounts describe with a consistency that is striking. Normal routines were performed with abnormal intensity, not because anything had changed externally, but because every routine action was now functioning simultaneously as cover for what was being prepared. A cobbler repairing a boot was also a man mentally rehearsing the sequence of a killing. A carpenter building furniture was also a man assessing the acoustics of a workshop and the path from the door to the workbench. The ordinary and the extraordinary existed in the same gestures, the same objects, the same minutes of the same days. Several accounts describe the specific quality of the sleep in those 48 hours, or the inability to sleep, and the particular sensation of a plan that has been thought about so many times that thinking about it any further is no longer productive, but that the mind refuses to release. One of the complications that arose in the final days before the operation was the behavior of some prisoners who were not part of the inner planning circle, but who sensed, through the subtle changes in the behavior of those who were, that something was being prepared. The camp's social environment was, after a year of proximity, one in which behavioral anomalies were noticed. Several accounts describe moments of near disclosure in the days before the 14th. A prisoner asking a direct question that required a deflection, a conversation that had to be terminated before it reached a dangerous subject. A moment when the gap between what the inner circle knew and what they could say became almost physically uncomfortable. These near misses were navigated without catastrophe, but they were real, and they illustrate the degree to which the plan's security in its final days was partly a function of luck, as well as discipline. By the evening of the 13th of October 1943, the night before, the plan was set, the roles were assigned, the timing was fixed. The inner circle had done everything that could be done in advance. What remained was the execution, in both senses of that word. The forest outside the wire was dark and quiet. The trains had stopped for the day. The guards were in their usual positions. The roll call had been completed, and the prisoner barracks were locked for the night. From the outside, Sobibor looked exactly as it had looked on every previous evening for the past year and a half. From the inside, in the specific silence of the barracks that night, something was different. A quality of wakefulness, of held breath, of a decision already made waiting for the morning to arrive so it could be acted on. The camp that the SS had designed to eliminate hope had become, in that particular darkness, a place where the most dangerous possible form of hope existed. The kind attached to a specific plan, a specific time, and a specific human cost that everyone involved had already accepted. Chapter 10. The 14th of October. The Uprising. The morning of the 14th of October, 1943, proceeded with the regularity that the camp's daily routine imposed. Roll call was conducted. Work commandos were assigned. The SS officers moved through their morning routines. The Trauniki guards took their positions. Nothing in the external observation of the camp indicated that the day would be different from any of the previous 500 and some odd days of the camp's operational life. This surface normality was not accidental. It was the last and most essential piece of the plan, and the people who were carrying it in their minds that morning were performing normality as a conscious and deliberate act, one that required more self-control than most accounts of the uprising give adequate credit for. The covert phase of the plan began at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the first of the SS officers was lured into one of the camp workshops. The sequence of invitations was calibrated to the movement patterns of specific officers whose whereabouts at specific afternoon hours had been observed and predicted. The first officer to enter a workshop did not leave it. The killing was done quickly with the tools available, and the body was concealed in a wardrobe under a workbench, in the spaces that the workshop geography permitted. The prisoner or prisoners who performed the killing then prepared for the next invitation. There was no alarm. The officer's absence was not yet noticed. The plan was working. Over the course of the next approximately 60 to 90 minutes, the covert phase proceeded through a sequence that survivor accounts describe with both the precision of people who had rehearsed it and the fragmented quality of people who had been in a state of extreme physiological stress while living it. Several more SS officers were drawn into workshops and killed. Each killing raised the stakes of the ones that followed. Each additional officer's absence from his normal location was an additional variable that could, at any moment, be noticed by another officer or a guard and trigger an alarm before the covert phase was complete. The planners had estimated that if they could kill 11 SS officers before the alarm was raised, the remaining SS and Trauniki personnel would be insufficient to contain the camp's prisoner population if that population moved as a coordinated unit. The number actually killed in the covert phase varies slightly between different historical accounts, but most sources consistently place it at around 11, which is precisely the threshold Pachersky had identified. The plan did not proceed without complications. Not every lure succeeded. At least one officer arrived at a workshop, but failed to enter the kill zone and withdrew before the operation could be completed. In one instance, the sound of a struggle within a workshop was partially audible to prisoners working nearby, who were not part of the inner planning circle, and the management of that moment, preventing a visible reaction that would attract guard attention, required the specific composure of people who were simultaneously terrified and committed to the plan's continuation. The historical record, reconstructed from multiple survivor accounts, is honest about these complications. The uprising was not the clean, cinematic sequence that later dramatizations sometimes present. It was messy, imperfect, and constantly threatening to unravel at its edges. The transition from the covert phase to the overt phase was triggered not by a precise, scheduled signal, but by the moment at which the continued concealment of what was happening became impossible. The precise circumstances of this transition vary between accounts. Some describe the discovery of a body, others describe an alarm raised by a guard who noticed anomalous prisoner movement. What all accounts agree on is that when Petruski's voice reached the roll call square, when he called out to the assembled prisoner workforce in a combination of Russian and Yiddish that the time had come, that the camp's SS officers were dead, that the prisoners should move together toward the wire, there was a moment, described in multiple testimonies, of something that was not quite silence and not quite sound, a collective intake of breath, a recognition, then movement. The overt phase was chaotic in the way that any attempt to move 600 people across an armed perimeter under fire is inevitably chaotic. The plan called for a coordinated movement toward the armory, the seizure of weapons, and then an organized assault on the perimeter wire. What actually happened was both like and unlike this plan. Some prisoners moved toward the armory, others, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from months of controlled passivity to the possibility of immediate action, moved directly toward the nearest point of the perimeter wire. The Trauniki guards in the watchtowers opened fire, mines that had been laid along portions of the perimeter, their presence known to the planners, but their exact locations not fully mapped, began to detonate as prisoners moved through them. The movement through the wire was accompanied by the specific sounds of a perimeter breach under fire, sounds that several survivors describe with the involuntary precision of extreme sensory experience. The chaos of those minutes was real and terrible. People were killed at the wire. People were killed in the minefield beyond the wire, the forest that had always been visible from inside the camp. That silent, dark line of pines that had been both a reminder of the outside world and a screen for the killing that happened inside was suddenly a destination, and people moved toward it with the specific determination of human beings who have accepted that any outcome in that direction is preferable to remaining where they are. Of the approximately 600 prisoners inside Sobibor on the 14th of October, roughly 300 managed to breach the perimeter wire and reach the forest. Not all of those 300 would survive the days that followed. The Germans launched an immediate pursuit operation involving the SS, the Trauniki Guards, German military police, and cooperation from local German garrison forces. The surrounding area was searched systematically. Some of those who had escaped were recaptured and killed in the fields and forests within the first 24 hours. Others survived the immediate pursuit only to be killed in the weeks and months that followed, by informers, by collaborators, by the ordinary lethal hazards of surviving in occupied territory as a Jewish person, without papers, resources, or shelter. Of the roughly 300 who initially escaped, approximately 50 to 60 survived to the end of the war, a figure that every historical account notes, and that requires a moment of genuine engagement. 50 to 60 survivors from 300 escapees, a survival rate from the escape itself of roughly 1 in 6. When set against the alternative, the near certainty of death in a camp that was, by October of 1943, in its final operational weeks. This figure represents not a failure, but the most complete possible expression of the choice that was made. The people who planned and executed the Sobibor uprising did not believe they were choosing between life and death. They were choosing between two different kinds of death, and they chose the one that included the possibility, however remote, of surviving to tell someone what had happened inside those wires. The afternoon of the 14th of October, 1943, marks the end of Sobibor as a functioning killing center. The German response to the uprising included the immediate shutdown of the camp's killing operations, the demolition of the camp's structures in the weeks that followed, and the deliberate planting of trees over the site to eliminate any physical evidence of what had occurred there. The silence that the camp's designers had always wanted. The permanent, documented silence of a site that had never officially existed and that would leave no visible trace, was, in a terrible irony, the response to the one act that made that silence permanently impossible. The uprising did not save 250,000 lives. It could not. But it ensured that the story of those lives, and the story of what took those lives, would survive. And in the specific moral economy of what happened at Sobibor, that survival is not a small thing. Chapter 11. The Manhunt, Escaping Through Occupied Poland. The forest east of Sobibor, in the October of 1943, was not a sanctuary. It was the beginning of a different and, in many ways, equally lethal phase of the ordeal that the Sobibor escapees had chosen. The immediate geography offered dense pine cover, sufficient to break the sight lines of the guards who fired from the watchtowers during the breach, sufficient to provide momentary concealment from the pursuit that began within minutes of the alarm being raised. But dense forest in occupied Poland in the autumn of 1943 was also a place with its own dangers. German patrols, hostile or frightened local populations, the fundamental problem of survival in the open without food, water, or any knowledge of the safe routes through a landscape that had been under German occupation for 4 years. Alexander Pechersky and the group of Soviet Jewish former prisoners of war who had arrived at Sobibor with him in September made for the east, toward the Bug River, toward the Soviet lines that were, by October of 1943, advancing westward as the German position on the Eastern Front continued to deteriorate. Pechersky's military training shaped his group's movement. They moved at night, avoided roads, maintained unit discipline, and navigated by the position of stars and by the accumulated geographical orientation that the months inside the camp had given them. The group numbered, in its initial composition, somewhere between 12 and 20 people. The precise figure varies between accounts, and it moved with the specific urgency of people who knew that the pursuit behind them was immediate and organized. The German response to the uprising was rapid, extensive, and tells us something important about how the SS administration assessed the security implications of what had happened. Within hours of the alarm, SS units and Trauniki guards had been deployed in a cordon around the camp's immediate perimeter. The following day, German military police and local garrison forces extended the search into the surrounding area. The operation was not simply about recapturing escapees. It was also about preventing the survivors from reaching anyone who might be able to document what they had witnessed. The people who had escaped Sobibor had seen the gas chambers. They had counted the transports. They knew the names of the SS officers and the approximate scale of the killing. They were, in the specific administrative logic of Operation Reinhardt's secrecy protocols, catastrophically dangerous witnesses. The escapees who moved in smaller groups, and many of the 300 who had breached the wire, moved individually or in pairs rather than in organized groups, faced the additional challenge of navigating the social landscape of occupied Poland. The response of the Polish civilian population to Jewish fugitives in this period is one of the most morally complex and historiographically contested aspects of this entire history. The documented record contains examples of Polish civilians who provided shelter, food, and information to escapees. Acts of genuine courage in an occupied country where harboring a Jewish person was a crime punishable by death, not only for the person who provided shelter, but for their entire household. The documented record also contains examples of Polish civilians who informed on escapees to the German authorities, either for the material reward offered, or from anti-Semitic motivation, or from the simple calculation of self-protection that occupation enforces on civilian populations. Several of the Sobibor survivors, who eventually lived to provide testimony, spent months in the forests and fields of the Lublin district, moving between farms, sheltered by individuals whose names appear in some accounts and not others, surviving through a combination of luck, skill, and the kindness of specific human beings who chose, at significant personal risk, to extend the most basic form of human solidarity. The fragmentary nature of these survival stories, the way they appear in the historical record as isolated episodes rather than continuous narratives, reflects the conditions under which they were lived. There was no continuous narrative. There was the next day, and then the day after that, and the calculation of each morning about where to move and whom to trust, and whether to stay or go. Pechersky's group reached the Bug River and crossed into the occupied Soviet territory to the east, eventually making contact with Soviet partisan units operating in the Brest region. The reception they received from the partisans was complicated, in ways that reflect the broader and often deeply uncomfortable history of Jewish participation in and relationship with the Soviet partisan movement. Some partisan units welcomed the trained military men among the Sobibor escapees and absorbed them into their operations. Others were hostile or suspicious, reflecting the anti-Semitism that was present in elements of the Soviet partisan movement, as it was present in the broader society from which those partisans came. Pechersky himself was eventually reunited with regular Red Army forces and was reintegrated into the Soviet military, serving for the remainder of the war. Leon Feldhendler's post-war trajectory was, as noted earlier, cut short by the violence of post-war Poland. He survived the uprising, survived the war hidden in the Lublin area, and was killed in April of 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender, in circumstances connected to the anti-Jewish violence that continued in parts of Poland, even after liberation. The specific details of his death are documented in Polish records of the period, and they constitute one of the more bitter ironies in a history that is full of bitter ironies. The man who had spent months building the organizational foundation of the only successful mass escape from a functioning Nazi death camp was killed not by the Nazis, but in the chaotic violence of a liberated country that had not yet completed the process of reckoning with its own relationship to the persecution of its Jewish citizens. The survivors who eventually reached safety and survived to the end of the war were scattered across a wide geographic area. Some made it to the Soviet Union and lived through the war's final years there. Some survived in hiding in Poland, protected by individuals whose moral courage deserves specific acknowledgement. A small number made it to Israel, then British Palestine, before or shortly after the war's end. The post-war diaspora of Sobibor survivors meant that the documentation of the uprising was, for many years after the war, fragmentary and geographically dispersed. Pechersky's memoir, published in the Soviet Union relatively soon after the war, was the most coherent single account, but Soviet ideological constraints on the memoir's framing, which tended to foreground the Soviet military aspect of the story and underplay the specifically Jewish dimensions of both the persecution and the resistance, meant that the account was not a complete or fully honest record of what had happened. The weeks immediately following the uprising saw the German administration move quickly to address the security breach that the escape represented. Not only were pursuit operations conducted, but within the camp itself. For those prisoners who had not escaped and who had been rounded up in the immediate aftermath of the breach, the consequences were swift and lethal. The few prisoners who had been captured during the pursuit or who had remained inside the camp during the overt phase were killed. The operational apparatus of the camp was shut down. The physical structures began to be demolished. The deliberate obliteration of the site was not a spontaneous or reactive decision. It was consistent with the broader Operation Reinhard policy of eliminating physical evidence of the killing centers once they had served their purpose, a policy already being implemented at Treblinka following the August uprising there. The manhunt for Sobibor survivors continued for months after the 14th of October. In some documented cases, German and police efforts to locate specific escapees extended well into 1944. The persistence of this pursuit reflects both security anxiety that the escapees' knowledge represented and the personal investment of the SS administrative apparatus in a narrative of total control that the uprising had catastrophically disrupted. Every escapee who reached safety was not just a survivor. They were evidence, a walking, breathing, articulate piece of evidence that the silence of the Sobibor forest had been manufactured, that the camp had existed, that 250,000 people had been killed there, and that the people who had killed them had believed, to the very end, that no one would ever know. Chapter 12. The silencing of the forest, liquidation, demolition, and the attempt to erase Sobibor. The decision to close and demolish Sobibor was not made in response to the uprising alone. It was part of a broader German strategic calculation that had been developing through the second half of 1943. A calculation shaped by the accelerating deterioration of the German military position on the Eastern Front, and by the approaching completion of the original killing task that Operation Reinhard had been designed to accomplish. By October of 1943, the great majority of the Jewish population of occupied Poland had already been killed. The ghettos had been liquidated. The transports that had fed the 3 Operation Reinhard camps for 18 months had dwindled. The operational purpose for which Sobibor had been built was, in the German administration's own accounting, essentially complete. What remained was the secondary task, and it was approached with the same methodical deliberation as everything that had preceded it. The demolition of Sobibor began within days of the uprising. The gas chambers, the brick buildings of Camp 3, were the first structures to be systematically destroyed. Their bricks removed and repurposed, their foundations broken up. The barracks, the administrative buildings, the watchtowers, the perimeter wire, all came down. The railway spur that had brought over 250,000 people into the camp was taken up and the track removed. The pits in which the earliest victims had been buried, before the later adoption of cremation on open pyres, were excavated, the remains burned, and the pits refilled. Trees were planted. The physical landscape was deliberately altered to resemble undisturbed forest. When the work was complete, by the late autumn and early winter of 1943, there was almost nothing on the surface of the Sobibor side to indicate that anything had ever been there at all. This deliberate erasure was part of a broader program, sometimes referred to in the historical literature by the German code name Aktion 1005, which involved the systematic destruction of evidence of mass killings across the occupied Eastern territories. Specially formed units, using prisoner labor, were tasked with exhuming mass graves, burning the remains on constructed pyres, grinding remaining bones, and scattering the ash across the landscape. The operational logic was explicit. If the physical evidence of the killings could be sufficiently destroyed before the war ended. The perpetrator's ability to deny what had occurred would be enhanced. The practical limits of this logic, the impossibility of erasing the knowledge held by survivors, by local civilian witnesses, by the hundreds of German officials who had processed the administrative paperwork of the deportations, were apparently not fully weighed by the people who ordered and executed it. The Traniki auxiliary guards who had staffed Sobibor were reassigned in the autumn of 1943. Some went to other SS installations. Some were deployed in anti-partisan operations. Their post-war fates were varied. Some were tried by Soviet military courts and executed in the late 1940s. Some disappeared into the anonymity of displaced persons populations in post-war Europe. Some lived undisturbed for decades before being identified through the gradual improvement of German, Soviet, and Polish archival research in the late 20th century. The systematic prosecution of Trauniki guards by West German and American courts in the 1980s and 90s produced a set of important legal precedents and a body of documentary evidence that significantly advanced the historical understanding of how the Operation Reinhard camps had been staffed and operated. The SS officers who had served at Sobibor had individual post-war trajectories that ranged from execution to decades of peaceful obscurity. Franz Stangl, as noted earlier, was eventually tracked down in Brazil by the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, extradited to West Germany, tried in Dusseldorf in the late 1960s, and convicted of the murder of 900,000 people. The estimated death toll at Treblinka, where he had commanded after leaving Sobibor, his testimony during the trial, and his extended conversations with the British journalist Gitta Sereny that were published in Sereny's 1974 book, constitute one of the most extraordinary and disturbing documents in the literature of perpetrator psychology. Stangl died in prison in Dusseldorf in 1971, less than 20 hours after completing his final interview with Sereny, a timing that historical accounts note without asserting causation. The physical site of Sobibor, the actual ground on which the camp had stood, remained in a kind of official limbo for much of the immediate post-war period. Poland was, after 1945, reorganized as a communist state under Soviet influence, and the memorialization of the Holocaust within the Eastern Bloc was complicated by ideological frameworks that sometimes foregrounded the narrative of anti-fascist resistance and Soviet military triumph in ways that left insufficient space for the specifically Jewish story of the camps. A memorial was established at the Sobibor site in the 1960s, but it was modest and received relatively little official attention or resources in the decades that followed. The site was, in a sense, suffering from the same erasure that its destroyers had intended, not through active suppression in the post-war period, but through the compounding effects of physical destruction, geographic remoteness, and the political and cultural frameworks that shaped memory of the war in communist Poland. The archaeology of the Sobibor site began in earnest only in the early 2000s, when a collaboration between Israeli, Dutch, and Polish archaeologists, notably including Joram Jaime and Wojciech Mazurek, began systematic excavation of the former camp's grounds. What the excavations found challenged some previous assumptions about the camp's physical layout and confirmed others. Most significantly, they recovered an extraordinary quantity of personal objects belonging to the camp's victims: clothing, shoes, personal documents, jewelry, identification tags, children's toys. The identification tag of the 6-year-old Dutch girl, Leah Judith de la Pena, mentioned in the previous chapter, was recovered in these excavations. So were hundreds of other objects, each representing a specific person, a specific life interrupted at a specific moment. The material counterweight to the deliberate destruction of documentary records. The archaeological work at Sobibor also, in one of the most significant physical discoveries of early 21st century Holocaust archaeology, identified the location and extent of the gas chamber building in Camp 3. Previous understanding of the precise location and dimensions of the killing facility had relied on survivor testimony and German post-war trial evidence, which did not always agree in their specifics. The excavations produced physical evidence, bricks, structural remains, chemical traces, that allowed researchers to map the building's footprint with a degree of precision that documentary evidence alone had not been able to provide. This physical confirmation of the gas chamber's location is not simply an academic matter. In a period when organized denial of the Holocaust's physical reality has become a documented political phenomenon, the material evidence of archaeology carries a particular evidentiary weight. The question of how the memory of Sobibor has been constructed and contested in different national and political contexts is one that deserves more space than a single chapter can provide, and we will return to it in detail in the later chapters of this documentary. But it is worth noting here, in the context of the camp's liquidation and the attempt to erase it, that the very deliberateness of the erasure contains within it a kind of historical evidence. The effort invested in demolishing the structures, removing the railway track, planting the trees, burning and scattering the remains. All of this effort implies knowledge, and knowledge implies complicity. The men who destroyed Sobibor knew what they were destroying. The bureaucratic records that document their demolition work, records that survived in German archives even when the camp itself was destroyed, are, in the specific irony of German administrative thoroughness, among the best evidence that the camp existed and that its operators knew it. By the late winter of 1943 to 44, the Sobibor site was a forest, a quiet, unremarkable stretch of pine trees in eastern Poland, crossed by a road that had once been a railway spur, sitting above ground that held, and would hold, until the archaeologists arrived 6 decades later. The material evidence of what had happened there. The birds moved through the canopy, the trees grew, snow fell and melted. Seasons passed over ground that the people who had built the camp had designed to be forgotten. And in various scattered locations across Europe and the Soviet Union, the people who had survived, 50 to 60 of them by the war's end, were carrying the memory that the demolition crews and the tree planters had been trying to bury. In the specific economy of what that memory meant and what it eventually produced in terms of justice, reckoning, and historical understanding, we have several more chapters to go. Chapter 13, The Long Arm of Justice, Trials, Accountability, and the perpetrators after the war. Justice, when it came for the men of Sobibor, came slowly, unevenly, and never completely. This is not a comfortable thing to state, but it is an accurate one, and any account that wraps the post-war legal history of the Operation Reinhard camps in a narrative of satisfying resolution is not being honest with the historical record. The men who designed, staffed, and operated Sobibor, who participated in the killing of approximately 250,000 people in a period of roughly 18 months, dispersed into the chaos of a defeated Germany in 1945, with varying degrees of concern about what awaited them. Some were captured immediately. Some were tried and executed within a few years of the war's end. Some lived for decades in comfortable obscurity in Germany, Austria, Brazil, and elsewhere, undisturbed by legal consequence, dying of old age in their beds. The gap between these two outcomes is one of the more important and less comfortable facts in the post-war history of Holocaust accountability. The immediate post-war period produced, in the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 46, an international legal framework for prosecuting crimes against humanity and war crimes. But the Nuremberg tribunal dealt primarily with the senior leadership of the Nazi state, the architects and directors of policy, rather than with the operational personnel of individual killing sites. The men who had commanded and staffed Sobibor were not figures of sufficient seniority to fall within Nuremberg's primary focus. Their accountability would have to come through separate national prosecutions, conducted by Germany, Poland, Austria, the Soviet Union, and other states over the decades that followed. These prosecutions were inconsistent in their pace, their vigor, and their outcomes, shaped at every stage by political considerations, by the practical difficulties of gathering evidence from dispersed and often deliberately concealed witnesses, and by a broader social reluctance in post-war West Germany to confront the full scope of what its institutions had organized and executed during the preceding decade. Franz Stangel's case is the most extensively documented among the Sobibor commandants, and it illustrates both the reach and the limits of post-war justice in this area. After the war, Stangl was initially captured and held by American authorities, but he escaped from a detention camp in Austria in 1948, an escape that subsequent investigations suggested was facilitated with the assistance of the same Catholic Church networks, specifically associated with a bishop named Alois Hudol in Rome, that helped a number of other senior Nazi criminals exit Europe via what historians call the rat lines. Stangl made his way to Syria and then to Brazil, where he worked openly for the Volkswagen Company in Sao Paulo under his own name for most of the 1950s and 1960s. He was located by Simon Wiesenthal's Documentation Center, extradited to West Germany in 1967, tried in Dusseldorf, convicted in 1970 of the accessory to the murder of 900,000 people, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in custody in 1971. The Dusseldorf trial of Franz Stangl was significant not only as a legal proceeding, but as a documentary event. The testimony given by survivors of Treblinka and Sobibor during the proceedings constituted one of the most extensive public records of the Operation Reinhard camps that had yet been compiled in a single venue. The cross-examination of Stangl himself produced an extraordinary set of exchanges in which a man who had commanded a camp that killed hundreds of thousands of people attempted to reconcile the actions he had taken with a self-image that was not, he insisted, that of a murderer. His statements during the trial, and in the extended interviews he gave to the journalist Gitta Sereny, eventually published in her book, Into That Darkness, have become foundational texts in the historical and psychological literature on perpetrator motivation, not because they exonerate him in any moral sense, but because they illuminate, with uncomfortable clarity, the interior architecture of a man who participated in mass killing while maintaining a functional self-conception as a decent and professional person. The prosecution of lower-ranking Sobibor personnel proceeded more unevenly. Several SS officers who had served at Sobibor were prosecuted in West German courts in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The Hagen trial of 1965 to 66, which focused on the Sobibor camp specifically, produced convictions of several former SS officers, though the sentences handed down struck many observers and survivors as disproportionately light relative to the crimes involved. The evidentiary challenges were substantial. Witnesses were elderly. Memories had been shaped by decades of post-war experience. Documentary records had been deliberately destroyed, and West German legal standards required a high burden of proof for individual criminal intent that was difficult to meet in cases where the defense consistently argued that defendants had acted under orders rather than from independent criminal will. The debate about whether German post-war courts applied sufficient rigor to Holocaust perpetrator prosecutions is a genuine and ongoing one among legal historians. The prosecution of Trauniki auxiliary guards took a different path through different legal systems. In the Soviet Union, proceedings against Trauniki men had begun relatively early in the post-war period, with military tribunals convening in the late 1940s and early 50s. These proceedings were faster and less constrained by the evidentiary standards that West German courts applied, and they produced death sentences for a number of former guards. The quality of the evidence and the fairness of the procedures in these Soviet-era trials has been questioned by some legal historians, though the basic facts of many convicts' participation in Operation Reinhard guard duties has been confirmed by later Western research. In the United States, the most prominent Trauniki guard prosecution in the Sobibor context was the case of John Demjanjuk, an American citizen of Ukrainian origin who had been identified as a former Trauniki guard who served at Sobibor. His case wound through American courts and extradition proceedings for over 3 decades, a legal odyssey that illuminated both the evidentiary challenges of prosecuting aging perpetrators and the political complications of doing so across multiple national jurisdictions. The Demjanjuk case deserves specific attention because it was, for many years, one of the primary mechanisms through which the specific history of Sobibor was brought before courts and therefore into public consciousness. Demjanjuk was initially identified in the 1970s and accused of being a particularly brutal guard at Treblinka. He was extradited to Israel, tried and convicted of crimes against humanity, with a death sentence imposed. However, subsequent evidence, including documents from Soviet archives that became accessible after the Cold War's end, created sufficient doubt about whether the Treblinka identification was correct, and the Israeli Supreme Court overturned the conviction. Demjanjuk was returned to the United States. A subsequent investigation focused on his documented service at Sobibor, and in 2009, he was extradited to Germany. In 2011, a Munich court convicted him of being an accessory to the murder of more than 28,000 people at Sobibor. A landmark verdict because it was the first time a German court had convicted a defendant on the basis of documented service at a killing center, without requiring specific evidence of individual criminal acts. Demjanjuk died in a Bavarian nursing home in 2012, while his appeal was still pending, meaning that the verdict was not formally final at the time of his death. But the legal principle established in the Munich proceedings, that documented service at a functioning killing center constitutes sufficient basis for criminal liability, became an important precedent for subsequent prosecutions. The prosecution of Sobibor SS officer Karl Frenzel represents another significant data point in the uneven history of post-war accountability. Frenzel had commanded the Camp 1 area at Sobibor, and multiple survivor testimonies identified him as personally responsible for specific acts of violence against prisoners beyond his general role in the camp's operation. He was tried in Hagen in the 1965 proceedings mentioned above, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He appealed, and his case went through a series of German court proceedings that eventually reduced his sentence. He was released from prison in the 1985. He lived until 1996, dying in his 80s in West Germany. The disproportion between the scale of his documented role in the killing operations of Sobibor and the actual punishment he served is a data point that historians of post-war justice consistently note, though without always agreeing on what systemic conclusions to draw from it. The role of the West German legal system in pursuing Holocaust perpetrators has been the subject of sustained critical scholarship since at least the 1960s, when journalists and historians began documenting the degree to which former Nazi officials had been reintegrated into the West German state apparatus. As judges, as prosecutors, as civil servants, in ways that created obvious structural conflicts of interest in the prosecution of war crimes. The research produced by the Zentrale Stelle, the West German agency established in Ludwigsburg in 1958, specifically to investigate National Socialist crimes, represents an enormous body of documentation, and the agency's work eventually produced prosecutions that, taken together, constitute the most comprehensive legal reckoning with Nazi-era crimes that any national legal system has conducted. But it is also true that the Zentrale Stelle operated for years in an environment of insufficient political and institutional support, that many of the cases it developed never reached trial, and that the men who managed its investigations frequently encountered obstruction, sometimes passive, sometimes active, from institutions whose personnel had their own complicated relationships with the era under investigation. What the post-war legal history of Sobibor ultimately demonstrates is a truth about justice that is both important and uncomfortable. Legal accountability is necessary but insufficient. It is necessary because the alternative, the complete absence of any formal reckoning, would be a different kind of historical catastrophe, one that would validate, retroactively, the calculation that mass killing could be conducted without personal consequence for its organizers and executors. But it is insufficient because the structures of national legal systems, their evidentiary standards, their statutes of limitations, their political dependencies, their temporal constraints, are not designed for the specific challenge of prosecuting mass atrocity decades after the fact. The survivors of Sobibor, who lived long enough to testify at the trials of their killers, did so knowing that no legal outcome would constitute adequate justice for 250,000 dead. They testified anyway. Their testimony was an act of the same fundamental disposition that had produced the uprising itself. The insistence that what happened would be documented, that it would be named, that it would be attributed, regardless of what any court ultimately decided to do with the attribution. Chapter 14. Memory, Denial, and the Return to the Earth. How the world forgot and then remembered Sobibor memory is not automatic. It does not simply persist on its own momentum through generations, accumulating weight and significance as time passes. It requires active maintenance, the deliberate effort of individuals and institutions to preserve, transmit, and keep alive what would otherwise dissolve into the general amnesia that time applies to everything. The memory of Sobibor, in the decades that followed the camp's destruction, was subject to a particular set of forces that made its maintenance more difficult than the memory of better documented and more publicly visible Holocaust sites. Understanding those forces is essential to understanding why Sobibor remained, for many years, less well known than its historical significance warranted, and why the process of recovering and transmitting that memory has been the work of specific individuals whose efforts deserve recognition alongside the survivors and resistors who came before them. The immediate post-war landscape of memory in Poland was shaped by the specific political conditions of a country that had experienced 6 years of devastating occupation, lost approximately 6 million citizens, approximately half of them Jewish, half of them non-Jewish Poles, and then emerged from German occupation into a Soviet-influenced political order that brought its own ideological frameworks to the question of how the war was to be remembered. The communist government of post-war Poland had both genuine reasons and ideological motivations to foreground certain aspects of the war's history. The resistance of the Polish underground, the suffering of Polish civilians under German occupation, the Soviet military's role in liberation, and to give less prominent space to the specifically Jewish dimensions of the Holocaust. This was not a uniform or fully consistent policy. And there were Polish historians and institutions who worked to document the Holocaust throughout the communist period. But the overall effect was to leave the memory of sites like Sobibor less institutionally supported than their historical importance required. In the immediate post-war years, the physical remoteness of the Sobibor site reinforced its memorial neglect. Auschwitz-Birkenau, located in a more accessible part of Poland, with surviving physical structures and a relatively large number of survivors who had been registered prisoner workers rather than killed on arrival, became the primary locus of Holocaust memory and memorialization in both Polish and international consciousness. This concentration of memorial attention on Auschwitz, a site whose scale and surviving physical evidence made it the most visible single location of Holocaust killing, had the unintended consequence of relatively reducing the public profile of the Operation Reinhard camps, where the absence of surviving structures, the deliberate destruction of evidence, and the small number of survivors made the documentary record thinner, and the memorial landscape more difficult to construct. The survivors of Sobibor, who lived long enough to write or speak their memories, constituted a critical but numerically small documentary foundation. Alexander Pajersky's memoir, published in the Soviet Union in 1945, was the earliest extended account in print, and its importance in establishing the basic narrative of the uprising cannot be overstated. But the Soviet publication context shaped the memoir in ways that obscured certain aspects of the story, particularly the specifically Jewish character of both the persecution and the resistance, which the Soviet ideological framework of anti-fascist struggle tended to subsume into a more universalized narrative of Soviet citizens and soldiers resisting German aggression. This framing, while not without its own validity, was incomplete, and it meant that Pechersky's account, the primary published source on the uprising for many years, was in some respects a filtered version of what had happened. The 1965 film Escape from Sobibor, based on a book by the American journalist Richard Rashke, and then the 1987 television film of the same name starring Alan Arkin and Rutger Hauer, brought the story of the uprising to a vastly wider international audience than any scholarly publication could reach. The television film in particular was seen by millions of viewers in multiple countries and had a documentable effect on public awareness of Sobibor as a site and the uprising as a historical event. The relationship between popular dramatization and historical accuracy is always complex. Dramatizations inevitably simplify, compress, and in some cases alter the historical record in the service of narrative requirements. But in the case of Sobibor, where the historical record was so little known by the general public, the popularizing effect of the film was, on balance, significant. It brought names and faces to a story that had been, for most people, an abstraction at best. The opening of Soviet and Eastern Bloc archives after the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s and early 90s was a transformative event for the historiography of Sobibor and the other Operation Reinhard camps. Documents that had been inaccessible to Western researchers for 4 decades. Soviet military records, NKVD interrogation files, captured German documents that had been seized by Soviet forces in 1945, became available and produced a significant revision and expansion of what historians knew about the camp's operation, their personnel, and the experiences of survivors. The Traniki personnel files, in particular, documents recovered from Soviet archives that contain detailed records of individual auxiliary guards, their assignments, their service histories, became central to the prosecution cases of the 1990s and 2000s and provided an unprecedented level of documentation of the guard structure of Operation Reinhard. The establishment of the Sobibor Memorial and Museum and its subsequent development and expansion represents the institutional side of the memory effort, and it has been an uneven story. A memorial marker had been placed at the site in the 1960s, but the site received relatively modest resources and attention for decades. The transformation began to accelerate in the first decade of the 21st century, driven in part by the archaeological work of Jaime Mazurek and their colleagues, which produced a physical rediscovery of the site that gave the memorial effort a new foundation of material evidence. The discovery of personal objects, the shoes, the identification tags, the fragments of personal documents, created a different relationship to the site's history than could be achieved through written records alone. Objects are immediate in a way that statistics are not. They require less cognitive mediation. They place a specific person at a specific moment, and in doing so they resist, more effectively than any argument, the abstraction that makes atrocity easier to dismiss. Holocaust denial, the deliberate, politically motivated rejection of the historical reality of the genocide, poses a specific challenge to a site like Sobibor, whose physical evidence was so thoroughly destroyed by its operators. The logic of denial frequently exploits the absence of physical evidence. If the gas chambers are gone, if the records were destroyed, if the survivor population is small, then the denialists claim that the site never existed or did not function, as history states becomes, in the denialist argument, somehow more sustainable. The archaeological work at Sobibor is, among its many contributions, a direct and material answer to this argument. The chemical traces of the gas chambers identified in the excavations, the structural remains of the Camp 3 building, the vast quantity of personal effects belonging to the victims. These are physical facts, not historical arguments, and they exist regardless of what any political movement or ideological tradition wishes to claim about them. The archaeologists who did this work were not motivated by politics. They were motivated by the same thing that motivated Feldhendler inside the camp: the refusal to allow the silence to continue. The role of the Netherlands in the memory of Sobibor deserves particular mention, because the Dutch national engagement with the deportation of Dutch Jews to Sobibor has been one of the more honest and sustained national reckonings with wartime complicity in the history of Holocaust memorialization. The Dutch government's deportation of approximately 35,000 Dutch Jews to Sobibor, facilitated by the cooperation of Dutch civil authorities, Dutch police, and Dutch railway workers with the German deportation apparatus, was a subject that Dutch society engaged with incompletely and inadequately for decades after the war. The gradual confrontation with this history, accelerating from the 1980s onward, produced formal governmental acknowledgements, educational programs, memorials, and, most significantly, a sustained effort to identify and document the specific individuals among the Dutch deportees. The transport lists that allow historians to name specific victims, including the 6-year-old Leah Judith de la Penha, whose identification tag was recovered from the soil of Sobibor, are, in large part, the product of Dutch archival thoroughness and Dutch post-documentary effort. The current state of Sobibor's memorial and historical infrastructure represents the accumulated result of these decades of effort: archaeological, legal, testimonial, educational, and political. The site today contains a museum, a memorial structure, and a landscape that acknowledges rather than conceals what lies beneath the surface. The names of victims are documented and displayed. The archaeological finds are preserved and interpreted. The testimony of survivors has been recorded, digitized, and made accessible through institutions including Yad Vashem in Israel, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and multiple European archives. None of this constitutes adequate justice. Justice, in the full sense, was structurally impossible from the moment the 250,000 dead were killed. But it constitutes the alternative to forgetting, which is the only alternative that was ever available. Chapter 15. The Survivors Speak Voices from the Other Side of the Wire. There is a particular quality to the testimony of people who have survived something that almost no one else survived, and who have lived for decades in the knowledge that their survival was partly a function of chance, partly of specific choices, and partly of circumstances that could have been otherwise on any given day. The survivors of Sobibor, those 50 to 60 people who lived from the uprising through to the war's end, carried their testimony through lives that were shaped by the specific weight of what they had witnessed. Some spoke publicly and often, driven by the conviction that silence was a form of complicity with the erasure that the camp's designers had intended. Some spoke rarely or not at all, finding that the attempt to put what they had experienced into language for an audience that had not shared it was a form of injury rather than relief. All of them represent a category of historical witness that is now, in the early 21st century, essentially closed. The last survivors of Sobibor have died, and what remains is the documentary record of what they chose to say while they were alive. Esther Arab was born in Poland in 1922 and arrived at Sobibor with her family in the spring of 1942. She was selected for the permanent prisoner workforce because of a particular skill she possessed, and she survived inside the camp through a combination of this functional value and the specific social intelligence required to navigate the camp's internal dynamics. She participated in the uprising on the 14th of October, 1943, escaped through the wire, and survived the war in hiding in the Polish countryside, protected at different stages by different people whose moral courage in an occupied country she consistently acknowledged in her later testimony. After the war, she eventually settled in Israel, where she gave multiple interviews and provided testimony to Yad Vashem. Her accounts of daily life inside the camp, the textures of the work, the relationships between prisoners, the specific behaviors of individual SS personnel, are among the most detailed and granular in the survivor record, and they form a substantial part of the documentary foundation on which the historical understanding of Sobibor's internal social structure rests. Selma Weinberg was a Dutch Jew, born in Groningen in 1922, who was deported to Sobibor in the spring of 1943 as part of one of the Dutch transports. She was selected for the prisoner workforce, one of a very small number of Dutch deportees who were not killed immediately on arrival, and she survived inside the camp for several months before the uprising. She had met a Polish Jewish prisoner named Chaim Engel inside the camp, and the two had formed a relationship that both would later describe as one of the central anchors of their psychological survival in that environment. They escaped together on the 14th of October, survived the war in hiding in Poland with the assistance of a Polish family, and eventually settled in the United States, where they married and built a life together. Selma Weinberg Engel gave testimony publicly on many occasions, and was one of the primary witnesses whose accounts helped establish the historical record of the Dutch deportations to Sobibor. Her story is significant both as an individual testimony and as a specific instance of the Dutch national experience of Sobibor. A Dutch woman deported from the Netherlands, surviving in Poland, eventually living in America, looking back across an ocean and 5 decades at a forest that had tried to erase her. Thomas Blatt was born in Isbeke in the Lublin district in 1927, making him 15 years old when he was deported to Sobibor in April of 1943. He worked in the camp as a sorting prisoner and, due to his youth and adaptability, moved between several commandos during his time there. He escaped in the uprising, survived the war in the Lublin area, and eventually emigrated to the United States, where he became one of the most publicly active of all Sobibor survivors. Giving lectures, writing a memoir titled From the Ashes of Sobibor, participating in legal proceedings as a witness, and cooperating extensively with historians and documentary filmmakers. Blatt's account is particularly valuable for its detail about the camp's internal social dynamics, the relationships between different prisoner groups, the behavior of specific SS personnel, and the day-to-day texture of survival in the sorting commandos. He was also one of the survivors who most explicitly engaged with the moral complexity of survival itself. The questions of luck, of choice, and of what it means to have been one of the few when so many were the many. The testimonies of the Sobibor survivors share certain structural features that are worth examining specifically, because they tell us something about the nature of extreme traumatic experience and its relationship to memory and language. The accounts are, almost uniformly, most detailed and precise about the first days and weeks inside the camp. The arrival, the selection process, the initial assignment to a commando, the first encounters with the camp's SS personnel, and its routines. This initial period is described with a sensory specificity: the smells, the sounds, the specific faces and voices, that later periods in the accounts often do not match. This is consistent with what trauma psychology tells us about the encoding of memory under conditions of extreme stress. Initial experiences in a new and threatening environment tend to be encoded with unusual intensity, while the long middle period of sustained duress tends to produce a more fragmented and less sequentially organized memory record. The specific challenge of communicating the Sobibor experience to audiences in different historical moments. In the immediate post-war years, in the 1960s and 70s, when the first significant wave of public Holocaust testimony was produced, in the 1980s and 90s, when survivor testimony became a central concern of Holocaust education and memorialization, is reflected in the way the same survivor's account sometimes shifts in emphasis and detail across different tellings. This is not a sign of unreliability. It is a sign of the normal human process by which memory is reconstructed in dialogue with the present moment and the anticipated audience. A survivor speaking to a Jewish community organization in New York in 1968 was situating their experience within a different framework than the same survivor speaking to a German court in 1972 or a school group in Tel Aviv in 1995. The core factual content of the accounts remains consistent. What shifts is the framing. What aspects are foregrounded? What questions are anticipated? What moral weight is given to which elements of the story? The question that survivors were asked most frequently, in informal settings, in formal testimony, in the standard questions of documentary interviews, was the question of how. How did you survive? How did you keep going? How did you find the will to participate in the uprising? These questions, however well-intentioned, reveal something about the assumptions of those asking them. An assumption that the will to survive, or the will to resist, required some special and explicable source. The survivors' answers to this question are remarkably consistent in their refusal of this framing. The most common answer, in various formulations across multiple accounts, is something close to, "I did not think about will. I thought about the next thing that needed to be done." This answer is psychologically precise and deeply instructive. It describes not heroism in the dramatic sense, but the specific cognitive strategy, the narrowing of temporal focus to the immediate task, that seems to be the most common mechanism of functional survival under conditions of extreme and sustained duress. The relationship between the Jewish and non-Jewish survivor communities in post-war Poland and the specific difficulties that Jewish survivors faced in the immediate post-war period shaped the documentary record of the Sobibor survivors, in ways that are not always acknowledged in the popular narrative. Post-war Poland experienced significant anti-Jewish violence. The Kielce pogrom of July 1946, in which approximately 40 Jewish Holocaust survivors were killed by a Polish mob, is the most documented instance. But it was not an isolated event. Jewish survivors who had returned to Poland after the war, or who had survived the war in Poland without being deported, faced a social environment in which their presence was often unwelcome and sometimes actively dangerous. Leon Feldhendler's death in April 1945 has already been mentioned. His fate was not unique. This environment shaped the decision of many survivors to emigrate from Poland as quickly as possible, to Israel, to the United States, to other countries. And it meant that the communities from which their testimony could have been gathered were dispersed before the full documentary work of collection was underway. By the early years of the 21st century, virtually all of the Sobibor survivors had died. The last survivors to have given public testimony did so in the first and second decades of this century. Elderly people in their 80s and 90s, whose voices by that point represented the absolute final generation of direct human memory of the camp. The passage from living memory to documentary record is always a significant transition in the history of any event, and Holocaust educators and historians have been aware, since at least the 1980s, that this transition was coming, and that its arrival would require a renewed and intensified emphasis on the documentary, archaeological, and educational infrastructure that would have to carry the memory forward without the living voices. The preparation for this transition, the large-scale digitization of testimony conducted by institutions including the USC Shoah Foundation, founded by Steven Spielberg in 1994, which collected and preserved the accounts of over 50,000 Holocaust survivors, represents one of the most important archival undertakings in the history of modern memory work. The voices from the other side of Sobibor's wire are now recorded voices, not living ones, but the specific quality of what they contain. The granular, precise, uncomfortable, morally complex testimony of people who survived the unsurvivable and chose to speak rather than remain silent has not diminished with the death of those who produced it. If anything, its significance has increased, because it is now the primary bridge between the historical reality of what happened at Sobibor and the living present in which that reality must continue to be understood, taught, and reckoned with. The survivors spoke so that the silence the camp's builders designed would not be the final silence. In the 21st century, the responsibility for ensuring that it is not has passed to everyone who has heard what they said. Chapter 16. What the ground remembers. Archaeology, science, and the physical evidence of Sobibor. There is a discipline that Holocaust historians have increasingly turned to in the early 21st century, as the survivor generation has passed, and the documentary record has been as thoroughly worked as its limits permit, and that discipline is archaeology. The excavation of Holocaust sites presents challenges that conventional battlefield or settlement archaeology does not. The remains are often deliberately disturbed or concealed. The ethical dimensions of excavating sites that are also mass graves require careful navigation, and the political and national sensitivities surrounding these sites mean that archaeological work cannot proceed independently of the community and governmental frameworks within which it operates. At Sobibor, all of these challenges were present, and the work that has been conducted there since the early 2000s has had to navigate them continuously. What it has produced, in terms of physical knowledge and evidentiary contribution, is extraordinary. The initial systematic archaeological survey of the Sobibor site was conducted as part of a collaboration between the Israel Antiquities Authority and a team of Polish archaeologists, beginning in 2007. The team which included Yoram Jaime and Wojciech Mazurek as its principal researchers, undertook ground-penetrating radar surveys, systematic surface collection, and eventually targeted excavations across the former camp area. The challenge they faced at the outset was that the site's above-ground profile had been so thoroughly altered by the deliberate demolition and tree planting of 1943 to 44 that the relationship between the current surface landscape and the camp's original layout was far from obvious. Historical maps derived from German administrative records and from the testimony of survivors provided a working framework. But these sources did not always agree in their specifics, and the ground-penetrating radar surveys frequently revealed subsurface anomalies that did not correspond to any documented feature of the camp's known layout. The personal objects recovered from the Sobibor site through systematic excavation represent the most immediately humanizing category of physical evidence, and their recovery requires careful methodology to preserve both the objects themselves and the contextual information, their spatial relationship to each other, and to the camp's structural features. That gives them historical meaning. Shoes have been recovered in large numbers, a finding consistent with the known processing sequence in which deportees were ordered to remove their shoes and leave them behind. Coins from multiple European countries document the geographic range of the deportee population. Personal documents, fragments of identity papers, letters, photographs survive in damaged but sometimes readable condition. Jewelry, personal ornaments, and the contents of pockets and bags are scattered through the soil in patterns that reflect both the sorting process and the post-war demolition activity that disturbed the original deposition layers. The most significant single structural discovery of the Sobibor excavations was the identification of the gas chamber building's foundation in Camp 3. This finding, achieved through a combination of ground-penetrating radar, systematic excavation, and chemical analysis of soil samples, established the building's footprint with a precision that prior documentary sources had not been able to provide. The chemical traces identified in the soil within the building's footprint are consistent with the use of carbon monoxide as a killing agent. They represent the degraded residue of a specific and identifiable industrial process, persisting in the soil decades after the building was demolished and the surface was planted with trees. This is, in the specific language of forensic science, physical evidence of the gas chamber's existence and location. It is not interpretive. It is not the product of historical argument. It is a measurable physical fact that exists in the soil of a forest in eastern Poland, and that will continue to exist there, regardless of what any political or ideological movement asserts about the history of the site. The methodological challenges of excavating a site that is simultaneously a mass grave, a crime scene, and a protected memorial require the archaeologists working there to operate within ethical frameworks that would not apply to a conventional archaeological dig. The remains of victims encountered during excavation cannot be removed and stored in the manner of conventional archaeological finds. They must be treated in accordance with the religious and cultural requirements of the communities whose members are interred there, which in the case of Sobibor primarily means Orthodox Jewish halakhic requirements regarding the treatment of human remains. This has meant that skeletal remains encountered during excavation have generally been left in place or reinterred rather than removed for laboratory analysis. A constraint that limits certain categories of physical evidence that could in principle be gathered, but that reflects a set of priorities about the dignity of the dead that the archaeological team has consistently honored. The ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Sobibor also identified anomalies in areas of the site that had not previously been mapped as part of the camp's known layout, suggesting that the camp's physical extent and internal organization may have been somewhat different from the reconstructions based solely on documentary and testimonial sources. This is a finding with genuine historiographical implications, because it means that physical investigation of the site is not simply confirming what was already known, but is producing new knowledge about the camp's geography. The history of Sobibor is, in this specific sense, still being written, not only in archives and testimonial collections, but in the ground itself, which retains a record of what happened there that no demolition crew could fully erase. The personal identification tag of Leah Judith de la Peña, recovered during the excavations, and identified through cross-reference with Dutch deportation records, has become one of the most significant single objects in the physical record of Sobibor. It is a small metal disc engraved with a name that was placed around the neck of a 6-year-old girl in the Netherlands, carried by her on a train across occupied Europe, and deposited in the soil of a Polish forest at the moment of her death. The object's material existence, its survival in the ground, while the child who wore it did not survive, its recovery by researchers 60 years later, its identification against a documentary record, constitutes, in physical form, everything that the words victim and individual and child are trying to convey when historians and educators use them in the context of Sobibor. It is a specific person. It has a specific name. She was 6 years old, and the ground remembered her. The ongoing archaeological work at Sobibor, which is not complete, and which continues to produce new findings as survey and excavation methods improve, has been accompanied by scientific analysis of the recovered materials that employs techniques not available to an earlier generation of researchers. X-ray fluorescence analysis of metallic objects allows identification of their material composition and, in some cases, their geographic origin. DNA analysis of biological material, where preservation is sufficient and where ethical protocols permit, can in principle establish connections between recovered remains and documented victim families. Dendrochronological analysis of wood fragments can establish when specific structures were built. These are not merely technical refinements. They represent the application of 21st century scientific capability to a historical problem that the perpetrators believed was solved by the simple act of planting trees. And in doing so, they represent a kind of scientific refutation of the logic of erasure. The relationship between the physical evidence gathered through archaeology and the testimonial evidence gathered from survivors is one of mutual reinforcement rather than competition. The testimonies of survivors describe what they saw and experienced inside the camp from a specific vantage point and under specific conditions of stress and limited information. The archaeological record documents what the ground preserves from a different angle. Not the subjective human experience, but the physical residue of events. Where the two records agree, the agreement is significant. Where they diverge, and there are areas of divergence, particularly regarding the precise layout of specific structures and the sequence of changes to the camp's physical organization over time. The divergence is a productive problem, a prompt for further investigation, rather than a reason to privilege one category of evidence over another. The most complete understanding of Sobibor emerges from holding both categories of evidence simultaneously, and from the willingness to let them complicate each other. The scientific and archaeological investigation of Sobibor is, in the broadest sense, an act of witness. It is the application of systematic human attention to a place that was designed to escape attention, to a record that was designed to be destroyed. The researchers who have done this work, Jaime, Mazarek, and their colleagues, are not performing an abstract academic exercise. They are insisting through the specific methods of their disciplines on the same principle that Leon Feldhendler insisting on inside the camp, and that the Sobibor survivors insisted on in their testimony. That what happened here happened, that it was done to specific people by specific people, that the physical world retains its record of this, regardless of who tries to erase it, and that the effort to recover and preserve that record is not optional for a civilization that wishes to understand what it is capable of. Chapter 17. The camp that fought back, what Sobibor means and why it matters now. We have been in this forest for a long time now. Across the preceding chapters, we have moved through the world that existed before the camp, the bureaucratic architecture that produced it, the daily mechanics of its operation, the human beings who were brought to it, the human beings who ran it, the slow and dangerous accumulation of a resistance that should not have been possible, the plan, the day, the escape, the pursuit, the liquidation, the decades of legal reckoning, the archaeology and the voices. We have tried to hold all of this simultaneously, the scale and the specificity, the systemic and the individual, the documented fact, and the honest acknowledgement of what is not fully known. We are now at the chapter where most documentaries do something that this one is going to resist. The chapter where everything is wrapped in a unifying moral bow, where the narrative arc resolves into a lesson, where the horror is redeemed by a meaning that makes it bearable. I am not going to do that. Not because there is no meaning here, but because the specific meanings of Sobibor are not the kind that get easier or more comfortable when expressed as general principles. They remain, if you stay with them honestly, sharp and resistant and somewhat difficult to live with. That difficulty is not a failure of the history. It is one of the things the history is trying to tell you. The story of Sobibor does not end with the uprising. It ends in the present, in every classroom where a teacher decides whether to teach this history or skip it, in every court where a prosecutor decides whether to pursue an aging perpetrator, in every political context where the machinery of dehumanization is being assembled in recognizable pieces. And the question of when to act is being asked with the specific urgency that the people inside Sobibor understood better than almost anyone who came after them. The uprising at Sobibor was, in strictly military terms, a limited success. 300 people escaped through the wire. Roughly 50 to 60 survived the war. The camp was closed, but it had already, by October of 1943, killed approximately 250,000 people, the vast majority of those it would ever kill. The uprising did not save 250,000 lives. No honest account of the history can claim otherwise, and any account that implies otherwise is substituting a comforting narrative for an accurate one. What the uprising actually achieved was both more modest and more profound. It demonstrated, in the most direct possible way, that the silence the camp's designers had built was not indestructible. It produced witnesses. It produced a documented act of organized resistance that has since become one of the most studied and most instructive examples of collective human agency under conditions of extreme duress in the history of the Second World War. The question of what the Sobibor uprising means for our understanding of Jewish responses to the Holocaust is a historiographical subject that has evolved significantly since the immediate post-war decades. The early post-war narrative tendency, most pronounced in Israel but present in broader Western culture, was to treat Holocaust victims as passive, to implicitly or explicitly contrast the perceived passivity of the European Jewish victims with the active resistance of the fighters and partisans who are more easily accommodated into heroic national narratives. This framing was always historically inaccurate and morally wrong, but it was powerful, and it shaped the public understanding of Holocaust history for decades. The history of Sobibor, and of Treblinka, and of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and of dozens of smaller acts of resistance across occupied Europe, is part of the sustained historical correction of this false narrative. Jewish victims of the Holocaust were not passive. They resisted in every way available to them, under conditions specifically designed to make resistance impossible. And the forms their resistance took included both the armed uprising and the quieter, equally demanding forms of resistance that maintained human dignity, community, and memory under conditions that were intended to destroy all three. The specific moral example of Leon Feldhendler and Alexander Pechersky, two men from completely different backgrounds, different countries, different languages, different relationships, to the specific historical moment they shared, is one that rewards extended reflection. Feldhendler, the rabbi's son from Lublin, who had spent months building a fragile organizational structure inside a death camp, with nothing but social intelligence, institutional memory, and an absolute refusal to accept the situation as unchangeable. Pechersky, the theatrical administrator from Rostov, who had survived 2 years of the war's worst conditions and arrived at Sobibor with a military officer's systematic attention to the physical realities of his environment. Neither could have done what they did without the other. The success of the uprising was inseparable from the quality of their partnership, from the specific complementarity of what each brought, and from the mutual trust they built quickly and under conditions where misplaced trust was lethal. In a history that sometimes reduces individuals to their symbolic function, they deserve to be remembered as specific people, not as types. The perpetrators of Sobibor also deserve to be remembered as specific people, and this is perhaps the more uncomfortable of the two rememberings. The historical impulse to reduce the operators of the Operation Reinhard camps to a category, monsters, sadists, ideological fanatics, is understandable as a psychological defense mechanism, but dangerous as a historical practice, because it creates a false distance between the perpetrators and the rest of humanity that flatters the rest of humanity while explaining nothing. The men of Sobibor were, in the documented record, recognizably human in their range of motivations, their social behaviors, their relationships with each other, and with the world outside the camp. They were capable of the full spectrum of human responses: cruelty and indifference, and occasional restraint and bureaucratic conscientiousness, and social warmth with each other, while simultaneously participating in the systematic killing of 250,000 people. This combination is not a paradox. It is a warning. It is what human beings are capable of when the institutional structures around them normalize mass killing as an administrative function, and when the psychological mechanisms of conformity, careerism, and incremental normalization have been given sufficient time to operate. The relevance of this warning to the present is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a specific and documented historical claim. The conditions that made Sobibor possible, the progressive dehumanization of a target group through legal and social mechanisms, the construction of administrative structures that distributed the personal sense of responsibility across enough individuals that no single person felt fully accountable, the use of physical isolation to prevent outside witnesses from documenting what was happening, the deliberate management of the population being targeted to prevent organized response. These are not conditions unique to Nazi Germany. They are conditions that have recurred in varying configurations and degrees in documented instances of mass atrocity since 1945. The study of Sobibor is not a historical curiosity. It is a case study in a mechanism whose components are recognizable and whose assembly, once begun, tends toward outcomes that were not fully intended by most of the individuals who contributed to it. The decision by the international community to establish the responsibility to protect doctrine, the formal international principle, adopted in 2005, that state sovereignty does not protect a government that commits mass atrocities against its own population, and that the international community has a responsibility to intervene, is, in part, the institutional residue of the lessons of the Holocaust. It is imperfectly implemented. It has been applied inconsistently, and in some cases, not at all. But it exists as a formal international norm, and its existence represents a specific response to the specific historical experience of sites like Sobibor. A recognition that the silence of a forest does not mean that nothing is happening inside it, and that the claim of sovereign right to conduct mass killing inside one's own borders is not an argument that the post-war world is prepared to accept without challenge. The gap between this principle and its practical application remains large. Closing that gap is the ongoing work of international institutions, civil society, and the individuals within them who understand why it matters. The people of the Dutch communities, whose members were transported to Sobibor, the people of the Polish Jewish communities of the Lublin district, the German and Austrian Jewish families, whose relatives arrived at the Sobibor platform in 1942 and 43, the Soviet families of the men who arrived in September of 1943. All of them have been shaped by what happened in that forest in ways that continue forward through subsequent generations. The specific quality of inherited trauma, the way in which the experience of one generation can shape the psychological and relational landscape of the next, even when the original experience is not fully spoken, is a subject of growing scientific and psychological literature. The descendants of Sobibor's victims and the descendants of its survivors carry within their family histories a weight that did not begin with them, and that will not be fully resolved within their lifetimes. This is not a statement of pathology. It is a statement of the specific human reality that follows from what happened in places like Sobibor. Not only in the bodies that were killed, but in the bodies that lived on and produced more bodies that are alive today. We began this documentary in a forest that does not look like a crime scene. We end it, hours later, in the same forest, but with everything that was invisible at the beginning now visible. The trains that used to run here, the wire that used to ring here, the people who arrived here and did not leave, the people who planned and acted and ran and survived and testified, the courts that heard the testimony, the archaeologists who found the objects, the 6-year-old girl whose name is on a metal disc in a museum, the 50 or 60 people who ran through the darkness of the 14th of October, 1943, with the forest ahead of them and the minefield beneath their feet, knowing the odds and running anyway. The forest is still here. The trees that were planted to cover the evidence are tall now, and the silence that the camp's builders designed, the permanent, total silence of a place that was meant to leave no trace and no witness, never came. Because some people ran, because some people survived, because some people chose to speak, and because you tonight chose to listen.